Chapter 1383. The Holy Emperor looked at the emotional Zadir and asked, "What is your purpose in coming here this time?" Hearing this, Zephyr retracted his wandering gaze and looked back at the Saint Emperor. He smiled and said, "I have two purposes for coming here this time." The Holy Emperor waited for a moment, but Zadir did not continue. He said, "Please elaborate." After hearing the Holy Emperor's question again, Zadir said calmly, "First, I want to avenge the nearly 10 billion soldiers of the Void Empire's expeditionary army who died. Second, I want to take away a person called Qinchuan." Zadir said that he had two purposes, but in the Holy Emperor's opinion, it was actually one purpose because the Void Empire's expeditionary army was destroyed by Qinchuan. The Holy Emperor looked at Zadir and said, "Our holy race has just suffered a defeat. We no longer have the ability to help you." Hearing the Holy Emperor's words, Zadir smiled and said nonchalantly, "Actually, I didn't expect Zerg to be able to help me." Zerg. When he heard Zadir call him that, the Holy Emperor was expressionless, but Huicho was furious. At this moment, Huicho finally understood why the Holy Emperor said that they were enemies. If the Void Empire really treated them as companions, they would definitely not call them Zerg. "Oh, right. Actually, I have two more things to ask of you." Zadir looked at the Holy Emperor with a smile and said, "The first thing is that I want you to help me guard this teleportation channel and not let it get damaged. Otherwise, I'll have to reopen the teleportation channel when I'm done. It'll be quite troublesome." As for the second thing, Zadir turned to Huicho and said with a smile, "This is my first time here, and I'm unfamiliar with this place. I need a guide, and I think this beautiful lady is very suitable." Hearing Zadir's words, Huicho could not help but look at the Holy Emperor. She really hated Zadir to the extreme. If she could, she really did not want to be his guide. However, what made Huicho feel regretful was that the Sage Emperor did not reject Zadir's request. "Since that's the case, I'll let Huiqian be your guide." The Saint Emperor looked at Zadir and said in a rather low voice, "However, he's only a guide." Zadir smiled and said, "Don't worry, she's just a guide. After this, I'll definitely let her return to your side safely." By this point, Zadir was standing next to Greychone. Beaming at her, he said, "Beautiful lady, why don't you show me around the Sage Monarch continent for a bit?" Although Huichon was extremely disgusted with Zadir, she did not show it on her face. She nodded with a rather cold expression and said, "Come with me." "All right." Zadir nodded and said, "However, please remember to use honorifics next time. I am of the same generation as your Saint Emperor, but I am not of the same generation as you." Hearing Zadir's words, Grayson's expression did not change. He said in a low voice, "Please follow me, Senior." "That's right." Zadir laughed heartily, looking very pleased with himself. Judging from his demeanor, he did not seem like an expert at all. The Saint Emperor stood at the peak of the mountain, silently watching Zadir and Huiqian's figures gradually disappear into the distance. No one knew what he was thinking. While everyone was wondering when the righteous army would launch their attack on the Holy Cluster, they unexpectedly retreated from Rubble Star to the Eking Nebula. Furthermore, they began to build fortifications in the Eking Nebula. It was as if they planned to defend the Eking Nebula. This performance could be said to have caused everyone's eyes to pop out of their sockets. Because of this seemingly cowardly display of the righteous army, the outside world had mixed opinions about them. However, Qinchuan was not in the mood to pay attention to these voices for the time being. Right now, he had more important matters to attend to, and that was to find the god text. Now, the damage to the runic sword had already recovered by 90%, and there was only 10% left before it could be completely healed. However, Dao runes and rune stones were no longer effective in repairing the damage of the runic sword. If Qinchuan wanted to completely repair the runic sword, he would have to find the legendary god text. According to the information that the Celestial Emperor had told him, there was only one god text, and it had disappeared when the runic continent collapsed. If the god text was in a universe that had been explored and developed, it should have been discovered long ago. Now that the god text was still missing, The biggest possibility was that it had fallen into the dark universe. However, the dark universe was extremely vast, and no one knew exactly how big it was. Finding the God text in the mysterious dark universe was more difficult than finding a needle in a haystack. Under the circumstances where there was no other way to repair the runic sword, Qin Xuan could only pin his hopes on the illusory God text. "Boss, you're leaving again." When Chen Changxing heard that Qin Xuan was leaving again, he could not help but reveal a bitter expression. Qin Xuan patted Chen Changxing on the shoulder and said, "I believe that you can definitely lead the righteous army and maintain good relations with all sides." Chen Changxing sighed helplessly and asked, "Boss, tell me the truth. Are you deliberately grooming me to be your successor?" In fact, Chen Changxing had this feeling a long time ago, but Qin Xuan did not express it too clearly at that time, so Chen Changxing did not pay much attention to it. However, recently, Qin Xuan's intention to groom him to be his successor had become more and more obvious. If he continued to play dumb, it would be somewhat unreasonable. Hearing Chen Changxing's words, Qin Xuan nodded and said frankly, "That's right. I do want to groom you to be my successor. I can't guard the human race and the demon race for the rest of my life, and you can't rely on me for the rest of your lives either. Therefore, you need to be independent. You need to be independent." Hearing Qin Xuan's explanation, Chen Changxing sighed again and said, "Everyone inherits their father's business. When you put it that way, I feel like I'm being groomed as a son. You're taking advantage of me." Qin Xuan laughed and said to Chen Changxing, "You actually found out." Chen Changxing was somewhat speechless as he raised his leg and kicked Qin Xuan. This old man was already a few decades old, yet he was still so childish. Qin Xuan looked back at the footprint on his butt and suddenly felt somewhat emotional. He could not help but say to Chen Changxing, "Only you would dare to do such a thing to me now." Chen Changxing grinned and asked, "You don't want to?" Qin Xuan smiled and shook his head. He said, "No, I'm very happy because this is what it feels like to be a human." Chapter 1384. In the past, Qin Xuan had investigated the divine runes, but he had collected very little information about them. Very few people knew about their existence, and those records were not of much use to Qin Xuan. If there was a place in the dark universe that Qin Xuan was most familiar with, it had to be the Banished Land. The Banished Land was a place where humans and demons lived in seclusion. Qin Xuan felt that the divine runes were very likely to exist in the Banished Land. Therefore, he set the Banished Land as his first stop to look for the divine runes. He was ready to go back and take a look. With Qin Xuan's current flying speed, he arrived outside the Banished Land in only 4 days. When he left the Banished Land, he had used the power of space rules to seal the Banished Land. Now the seal was intact, which meant that no one had disturbed the Banished Land after they left. Qin Xuan flashed through the seal and entered the Banished Land, the center of the Kunlun's field. The center of the Kunlun's field was no longer the first line of defense against foreign invaders. However, new cultivators from the human and demon clans would still come to the center of the Kunlun's field to train. When Qin Xuan left, he had told Gao In that if anyone wanted to leave the Banished Land and go to the outside world, they could go to the center of the Kunlun's field. He would send people back later to take those who wanted to leave to the outside world. It had been a few years since they left. A group of cultivators who wanted to go to the outside world had appeared in the Banished Land. They had all come to the center of the Kunlun's field, waiting for the opportunity to come. Qin Xuan did a rough calculation. There were at least 2,000 cultivators above the golden core stage in the center of the Kunlun's field. The human and demon clans made up about half of them. However, Qin Xuan only watched from afar. He did not plan to alert too many people this time and could not take them away. However, he would send a message to the city of starting points later and let the people there take them away. Qin Xuan left the center of the Kunlun's field and landed in the Star Dragon Federation. The Star Dragon Federation was still prosperous. It was not affected by Qin Xuan's departure at all. Gowan was still the president of the Federation, and the Black Moon Combat Academy was still the top academy. Qin Xuan only looked at the Black Moon Combat Academy and the Dragon Spirit Lake graveyard from above the City of the Elves. Then, He left to go to Star Dragon City. In Star Dragon City, Gao In was dealing with official documents in his office. When he put down his pen and was about to rub his eyebrows, a gentle voice suddenly sounded in his ear. Work is part of life. Don't spend all your time on work. Even if you're a nascent soul stage cultivator, you won't be able to take it after a long time. Hearing this familiar voice, Gao unsubconsciously looked up at Qin Chuan, who was standing by the window. When he saw Qin Chuan's appearance clearly, he was pleasantly surprised. Qin Chuan, why are you back? Qin Chuan smiled and said, I came back to take care of some things. I also came to see you. Gao smiled and stood up. He walked to the side table and began to make tea. As he boiled water, he asked Qin Chuan, Did you come back alone this time? Qin Chuan walked to the sofa and sat down. He replied, I came back alone. I didn't alert anyone. Don't tell anyone about this. Gao looked at Qin Chuan with some surprise and asked, Wangbo didn't tell you either? When he left, Wangbo originally wanted to take his family with him and leave with Qin Chuan. However, he gave up in the end and chose to stay. When Wangbo made this choice, he said this to Qin Chuan. Now that one of us is out there, one of us has to stay here to guard the base. I'll stay in Star Dragon City and guard the Star Dragon Federation for you. If you feel wronged or bullied one day, you can come back. Here, there must be someone who can make you feel warm and comfort your wounded heart. Zhang Tai nodded and said, I don't know what to do with you. At that time, when Qin Chuan heard Wangbo's words, he was a man who never shed tears in the face of the threat of death. However, when he saw Wangbo's simple and honest smile, his eyes turned red. Although he was now a demigod and Wangbo was only a nascent soul stage cultivator, in Qin Chuan's heart, Wangbo would always be his brother, his best brother. Gao also knew about this matter, so he was surprised. Could it be that Qin Chuan wanted to hide his return from Wangbo? Qin Chuan shook his head and said, It's better not to tell him. I've already secretly taken a look at him just now. He's doing very well now. When I have the chance in the future, I'll go and see him again. Since Qin Chuan had already made a decision, Gao no longer tried to persuade him. Instead, he asked, Is there anything I can help you with? Qin Chuan nodded when he heard this and said, There is indeed something I need Brother Gao's help with. Gao poured a cup of tea for Qin Chuan, then sat opposite Qin Chuan and waited for Qin Chuan to finish speaking. Qin Chuan thought for a long time and even scratched his head, then said, I want to find a word. Gao couldn't help but be stunned when he heard this. Find a word? What does this mean? I saw you scratching your head just now. It seems that you don't know what to say. I didn't expect it to be such a special thing. No wonder you don't know what to say. Gao smiled helplessly and said, Can you be more specific? Qin Chuan sighed helplessly and said, Actually, I don't know what I want to find, but the image should be a word. As for what this word is, I don't know. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Gao felt a little dizzy. Even you don't know what you're looking for. How can I help you? Forget it, Brother Gao. You might as well order people to find the strange places on the continent and then gather the coordinates. I'll look for it one place at a time. In desperation, Qin Chuan could only use this stupid method to find the divine text. Gao was a little annoyed and said, But the scope is too big. In the Star Dragon Federation, the Demon Realm, and the Jia Mountain, there are at least thousands of places with strange things. If you want to look for them one by one, it's too much of a waste of time. This is the only way I can think of now. Qin Chuan spread his hands and said, Although this method is a little stupid, it's still effective. Gao nodded and said, I understand. Then I'll pass down the order. By the way, in the Jia Mountain and the Demon Realm, can you not reveal the news of your return? Qin Chuan thought for a while and nodded. Try to keep it a secret. Chapter 1385. Gao's efficiency was extremely high. In just 3 days, he had compiled the coordinates of all the strange places in the Star Dragon Federation. As for the Realm Mountain and the Demon Realm, it would take some time. Gao sent the information to Qin Chuan via photon computer. These are all the strange places in the Star Dragon Federation. There are a total of 4,329 places. Do you really want to look for them one by one? Qin Chuan nodded. There's no time to lose. I'll take my leave. Before he even finished speaking, Qingchuan's figure had already disappeared. He was heading straight for the strange place closest to Star Dragon City, Sage Monarch Continent. On the shore of a beautiful inland lake, Haisho was sitting on a rock. He had a strange expression on his face as he looked at Zadie, who was standing by the lake with his arms spread wide open as if he wanted to embrace the entire lake. Over the past few days, Greyhorn had acted like a proper guide, taking Zadie around the Sage Monarch Continent to enjoy the scenery and participate in some special folk activities. Greyhorn had assumed that it wouldn't take long for Zadie to show signs of impatience. But to his surprise, Zadie didn't show any signs of impatience. In fact, he even seemed to be enjoying himself. Every time they went to a scenic spot, he would take pictures and pose for souvenirs. He was like a real tourist, so much so that Greyhorn almost forgot that he was just an amateur guide and that Zadie hadn't come to the Sage Monarch Continent for the sake of sightseeing. The name of the lake was Golden Lake, because the lake water would turn golden every morning and evening. Zadie liked the lake very much, and even wanted to build a courtyard by the lake so that it would be convenient for him to come here for a vacation in the future. This kind of life facing the sea, with flowers blooming in the warmth of spring, is really wonderful. I really yearn for it. Zadie closed his eyes and basked in the blazing sun. He seemed to be enjoying this feeling very much. When Haisho heard Zadie's words, the corner of his mouth couldn't help but twitch. He didn't know what to say. When Zadie didn't get a response from Haisho, he turned around and looked at him with a smile. "Friend, don't you like the beautiful scenery here?" Hearing this, Huichin replied, "Senior, I've lived in this area since I was young, so I've developed a certain immunity to the beauty of the Golden Lake. No matter how beautiful the scenery was, if one had to see it every day, one would find it boring." Hearing Greychong's answer, Zadie replied with some regret, "What a pity. If I was born in this place, I would definitely linger on the lakeside scenery every day and never get tired of it." Hearing this, Huicho suddenly asked curiously, "Senior, is there anything you like in the Void Empire? What does it look like?" Hearing Grissom's words, Zadie glanced at Grissom and said, "Do you know why the skin color of our Void Empire's people is dark purple?" Hearing this, Grissom shook his head and answered honestly, "I don't know. The reason isn't complicated. It's because our Void Empire is shrouded by the power of the Void all year round. Everyone's body is corroded by the power of the Void at birth. Newborns are corroded for a shorter period of time, so their skin color is faint purple. The longer they live in the Void Empire, the darker their skin color becomes. Moreover, there's no sunlight in the Void Empire. It's a place where there's no light all year round. It's gloomy and dark." Speaking of the Void Empire, Zadie couldn't help but sigh. There really wasn't anything beautiful in the Void Empire that was worth his liking. Hearing Zadie's words, Grissom couldn't help but be surprised. This was the first time he knew that the Void Empire was so strange. Zadie looked at Grissom and suddenly asked, "Does this universe of yours have a name?" Grissom shook his head and said, "A universe is a universe. It doesn't have a name." Zadie took a deep look at Grissom and said, "But in the Void Empire, your universe has a name. It's called the Bright Universe, while the Void Empire is called the Dark Universe." Bright Universe? Dark Universe? Hearing Zadie's words, Grissom's heart skipped a beat. He asked, "Is the origin of this name because of the unique characteristics of the two universes?" Zadie nodded lightly and said, "That's right. In your universe, which is the Bright Universe, there's warm sunlight everywhere. Everyone can enjoy enough sunlight every day to warm their body and mind. The environment is also filled with the chirping of birds and the fragrance of flowers. Beautiful scenery can be seen everywhere. But in the Dark Universe, in the Void Empire, even the light emitted by electrical appliances is a demonic purple. The relationship between the Bright Universe and the Dark Universe was like the relationship between day and night. They were two sides of the same coin and also two opposing sides." Grissom looked at Zadie with a complicated gaze and said, "Those who have never seen sunlight or smelled the fragrance of flowers must be very pitiful." Zadie didn't get angry when he heard Grissom's words. He smiled and said, That's right. Such a life is really too pitiful. So when I learned of the existence of the bright universe, I had a dream. That is, to take a sun from the bright universe and illuminate the void empire. When he heard Zadie say that he wanted to take a sun, Grissom asked curiously, "With your current strength, you should be able to take a sun with you, right?" Zadie nodded and said, "With my current strength, I can indeed take a sun with me back to the void empire. But I don't want to do so because the light of one sun isn't enough to illuminate the entire void empire." Grissom's expression changed slightly when he heard this. He asked, "What do you want to do?" Zadie grinned and said, "Do you think that if we swap roles, the lives of the void race will be much better than before?" Swap roles? Grissom seemed to have seen through Zadie's intentions. He said in a serious tone, "You want to invade our universe en masse? No, this isn't your universe. This is the bright universe, everyone's bright universe." Zadie looked at Grissom and said indifferently, "You have lived in the bright universe for countless years. Now, the warm sunlight, the fragrance of flowers, and the beautiful scenery should all be enjoyed by the void race. One sun couldn't illuminate the entire void empire, but the sun of the entire bright universe could definitely illuminate the entire void empire. So as long as the void empire was moved to the bright universe, the lives of the void race would definitely be very good. The residents of the bright universe would never agree to the relocation of the void empire, so they could only use force to suppress all voices of opposition. As for the dark universe, it would be a place to exile captives." Chapter 1386. We heard Zadier clearly express his intention to invade the bright universe on a large scale. Grayson's expression suddenly became extremely ugly. "Aren't you here for Qin Chuan?" Zadier smiled. "Yes, I'm here for Qin Chuan, but that doesn't conflict with my other goals. After all, dealing with Qin Chuan won't take too much time. I won't let you get away with your scheme." If Zadier wanted to make a move on Qin Chuan, she wouldn't care. But if Zadier wanted to invade the Radiant Universe, then she couldn't just stand by and watch. Zadier looked at her with a playful smile. "Do you think you're strong enough to threaten me?" Hearing Zadier's words, Grey Chuan was just about to make a move when she realized that her entire body was frozen in place. She couldn't move at all. Streams of dark purple void energy surged in from all directions and wrapped around her body like chains. Grey Chuan turned pale with fright. "What are you doing?" she asked Zadier. "Don't worry, I won't kill you. I just want you to be quiet for a while. Don't cause any trouble for me." Zadier smiled at Grey Chuan. With a wave of his hand, he and Grey Chuan disappeared from the Golden Lake and reappeared outside the Sage Monarch continent in the blink of an eye. Zadier looked at the vast universe in front of him and said, "Let's go. We're going to find Qin Chuan, the land of exile." After Qin Chuan received the coordinates of all the strange places in the Star Dragon Federation from Gon, he began his long, boring journey. Although Qin Chuan had lived in the Star Dragon Federation for the first 20 years of his life, this was the first time he learned that there were so many special places in the Star Dragon Federation. There were some places where the water was black all year round. However, this black color wasn't due to pollution. Instead, it was a kind of clean and drinkable black water. For a long time, no one had been able to find out what was going on. However, Qin Chuan's arrival this time cleared up the matter. It turned out that the reason why the water was black was because there was a mineral deposit near the source of the water. There was a large amount of black crystals buried in it. Black crystals were a very peculiar mineral. Under normal circumstances, they looked like ordinary stones. However, when they came into contact with high-purity spiritual energy, they would turn into black crystals. The purity of this spiritual energy required one to be at least in the divine transformation stage. This was also the reason why no one had been able to discover this black crystal mineral deposit before Qin Chuan's arrival. Black crystals were a type of energy crystal. After being purified, they could be used as a battleship's energy source. Therefore, they were quite valuable. However, Qin Chuan had no interest in black crystals. He had come out this time to search for divine runes, not to make a fortune. This is already the 1,200th strange place. Qingchuan stood on top of the black crystal mineral deposit and looked at the black water not far away. He couldn't help but reveal a hint of helplessness on his face. In the past few days, Qingchuan had walked through almost half of the Star Dragon Federation and visited more than 1,000 strange places. Although his body wasn't tired, his heart was still somewhat tired. I hope the divine runes are in the remaining 3,000 strange places. Now, Qingchuan could only place his hopes on the remaining strange places. If he couldn't find anything in the Star Dragon Federation, then he could only place his hopes on the Realm Mountain and the Monster Realm. While Qingchuan continued to visit the mountains and rivers of the Star Dragon Federation, Zadier had already brought Huichong to the Rocky Star. Is this the Rocky Star? I've heard of this place. Zadier looked at the Rocky Star in front of him. He raised his hand and gently pointed at the Rocky Star. A small, dark, purple ball of light shot out from his fingertip and flew toward the Rocky Star. Huichong saw this scene and asked in surprise, "What are you trying to do?" Zadier smiled and said to Huichong, "I want to set off a grand fireworks show to announce my arrival to the entire radiant universe." Hearing Zadier's words, Huichong guessed Zadier's intention. This guy actually wants to set off the Rocky Star to announce his arrival. While Huichong was thinking about this, the dark purple ball of light had already arrived above the Rocky Star. None of the Tian people on the Rocky Star noticed the arrival of the dark purple ball of light. When the dark purple ball of light shot into the ground of the Rocky Star and detonated the planet's core, they didn't even know what had happened before they were destroyed along with the Rocky Star. The explosion of the Rocky Star was like a grand fireworks show, bright and beautiful. Seeing this scene in front of her, Huichong's mind suffered a great impact, and she was completely stunned. Huichong was not a good person. She had killed many people. Some people deserved to be killed, while others were killed because she wanted to. She could be said to be an evil person who despised life. However, even someone like her, even in her craziest moment, had never thought of destroying a planet. Moreover, she had done it so cleanly that she didn't even need to think. It was as natural as eating and drinking. This is a planet suitable for living. How could it be destroyed so easily? Huichong looked at Zadier. She felt that Zadier was a madman. When a normal person faced such a planet, shouldn't they be thinking about how to occupy it? Hearing Greichong's words, Zadier smiled and said, "This is indeed a habitable planet. However, the people who live on this planet aren't from the Void Tribe, so it's not a pity to destroy it." Huichong couldn't help but say, "Didn't you say before that you wanted to invade the radiant universe and occupy it? If that's the case, this planet will be your territory in the future. It's your property. Are you going to destroy it just like that?" Zadier glanced at Huichong and said, "There are too many planets in the radiant universe. There are countless planets suitable for living. Destroying one or two is not a big deal. Don't you think the fireworks are beautiful? I only see madness." Huichong felt that she couldn't continue to communicate with Zadier. Their thoughts were not on the same channel. Madness? Maybe. Zadier smiled. He wasn't angry because of Huichong's evaluation of him. In his opinion, getting angry because of other people's evaluation was a very stupid thing to do. Now, the news of the Rocky Star should have spread to the Iki Nebula and reached the ears of the higher-ups of the Righteous Masters. Do you think they will be afraid? What is Qingchuan thinking now? Zadier looked in the direction of the Iki Nebula. His eyes were full of anticipation. He couldn't wait to rush to the Iki Nebula to meet Qingchuan. He could even imagine the expression of anger and hatred on Qingchuan's face. It would definitely be very exciting. Chapter 1387. Iki Nebula, Planet Iki. When Planet Iki exploded, the news immediately spread to the base of the Army of Justice on Planet Iki. All the higher-ups were gathered in the conference room, and everyone had a serious expression on their faces. Chen Changxing looked at the crowd and said, "I'm sure everyone has heard about Planet Iki. Planet Iki exploded without any warning, so it shouldn't be a natural disaster. Up until now, Chun Changxing only knew that messy rock star had been destroyed in an explosion. However, he did not know how this explosion had happened. It can't be a natural disaster. Tiansen shook his head and replied, "Not long ago, when we Tian people defined Planet Iki as a military base, we tested the energy of Planet Iki's core. Planet Iki's core is rich in energy, and it can support Planet Iki for at least another 7,000 years. Therefore, no matter what kind of natural disaster happens on Planet Iki, it can't directly cause Planet Iki to explode." Tiansen paused for a moment, then continued. "In my opinion, there can only be one reason for Planet Iki's explosion, and that is that Planet Iki's core was attacked." Hearing Tiansen's words, the expression on everyone's face became serious. The core of the chaotic rock star was suddenly attacked. Who would do such a thing at such a time? Luzi looked at everyone and asked, "Do you think the person who did this is Zerg?" Zhou Lin frowned and said, "Now that the demon race can't do anything, our only enemy is Zerg. Only Zerg would do something like this. But Zerg doesn't seem to have any reason to provoke us at this time, right?" Thelon frowned. He had a feeling that this matter wasn't as simple as it seemed. Huang Feng looked at everyone and said, "Why don't we tell Qin Chuan about this matter first, and let Qin Chuan come back first?" Planet Iki's sudden explosion was a matter of great importance, so Huang Feng felt that it was necessary to tell Qin Chuan about it in time, and let Qin Chuan come back as soon as possible to take charge of the situation. Huang Feng's suggestion was approved by many of the people present. Although Chun Changxing was very talented in commanding battles, he still needed Qin Chuan to stabilize people's hearts. Just when everyone proposed to let Qin Chuan come back, Yao Rao suddenly opened her mouth and asked, "Do you think the person who did this kind of thing is from Void Empire? It's been so long since we wiped out the Void Empire Expeditionary Army. No matter how slow the Void Empire's reaction is, they should have responded by now." Hearing Yao Rao's words, everyone was dumbfounded for a moment. When they first learned about this matter, all of them immediately thought of Zerg, but they had never thought whether this matter was related to Void Empire or not. But now hearing Yao Rao mention Void Empire, after carefully thinking about it, this possibility was not impossible. Chun Changxing looked pensive, then gently nodded and said, "Hearing what you said, I instead feel that Void Empire is more suspicious. Planet Iki is the bridgehead to attack the Celestial Cluster, so its geographical location is very important. If Zerg wanted to start a war, he would have found a way to occupy Planet Iki, not destroy Planet Iki. Last time Zerg occupied Planet Iki, so if they wanted to destroy Planet Iki, they wouldn't have waited until now." Hearing this, Huang Feng immediately said, "In that case, we should inform Qin Chuan as soon as possible and let Qin Chuan come back." Luzi frowned and said, "But what Qin Chuan is doing now is very important. If we call Qin Chuan back before determining who the enemy is and whether they are a threat, wouldn't it make us seem too incompetent?" Hearing Lu Zi's words, everyone felt that it made sense. Destroying a planet was not difficult for the people present. Even some powerful body integration realm overlords could destroy a planet. Calling Qin Chuan back before determining the strength of the enemy was indeed a bit too incompetent. Hearing this, Huang Feng smiled bitterly and said, "Don't you think that the enemy is not afraid of Qin Chuan's revenge, since they still dare to destroy Planet Iki, despite knowing Qin Chuan's existence? In my opinion, since they dare to do so, it means that they are not afraid of Qin Chuan, so there's a high chance that they are a perfected existence." Hearing Huang Feng's explanation, everyone's expression changed slightly. They had already guessed that if the Void Empire were to descend again, it would be at the level of a pinnacle existence. Otherwise, it would be nothing more than a suicide mission. If the enemy is a perfected existence level powerhouse, do you think it would be useful to call Qin Chuan back? Zhou Lin looked at Huang Feng and frowned. No matter how strong Qin Chuan was, he was only limited to the level of a demigod. There was no way he could compare to a perfected existence. Everyone calm down. Don't get agitated. Seeing that an argument was about to break out, Chun Changxing immediately stepped forward to be the peacemaker. He glanced at Zhou Lin and said, Senior sister, something this big has happened. We have to notify the boss. As for whether he wants to come back or not, he will naturally make the decision. Hearing Chun Changxing's words, Zhou Lin did not say anything else. Seeing that everyone had quieted down, Chun Changxing tried to contact Qin Chuan. However, to everyone's surprise, Qin Chuan was once again uncontactable. Seeing that Chun Changxing could not contact Qin Chuan, Lu Zi said to everyone, Qin Chuan left this time to search for something. He once told me that he might enter the dark universe, so it's normal that we can't contact Qin Chuan. Hearing Lu Zi's words, a trace of helplessness appeared on everyone's faces. If Qin Chuan had really entered the dark universe, then it would really be difficult for them to contact Qin Chuan. Therefore, I suggest that we think of a way to solve this matter ourselves. Lu Zi looked at everyone and said, if anyone has any good ideas, feel free to share them. Perhaps we can come up with a good idea. Just as Lu Zi finished speaking, Tian San said, when I found out about this matter, I was already thinking of a countermeasure. Since the other party has already destroyed Messy Rockstar, it means that they have no intention of hiding at all. We must publicly condemn their actions and force them to reveal themselves. If we want to deal with the enemy, we must first understand who the enemy is. Elder Tian San's words make sense. Only when we know the other party's identity can we make the right decision. Huang Feng agreed with Tian San's suggestion. Chun Changxing turned to look at the others and asked, what about you guys? Do you have any objections? I have no objections. Before Chun Changxing's voice fell, someone couldn't wait to respond to Chun Changxing. However, this voice sounded a little unfamiliar. Chapter 1388. When Chun Changxing heard the words, I have no objections, he did not react at first. However, he soon sensed that something was amiss. He looked around and asked in a subtle tone, who said, I have no objections just now. Everyone was slightly stunned when they heard Chun Changxing's words. Everyone had heard the words, I have no objections just now, but did not seem to have come from anyone around them. Chun Changxing's expression quickly turned gloomy in the face of the silent and confused crowd. At this time, Zhou Lin and Lu Zi had also realized that something was not quite right. Just as they were trying hard to recall the source of the voice just now, the voice actually rang in everyone's ears again. Yo, we're above you. Hearing this slightly mocking voice, everyone present subconsciously raised their heads and looked at the ceiling of the conference room. They saw a tall figure hanging upside down on the ceiling of the conference room. Next to this figure was a figure bound by a dark purple rope. No one was unfamiliar with this bound figure. It was Zerg's supreme existence in the tribulation stage, Huizhong. When he saw the tall figure and Huizhong, Chun Changxing's expression suddenly changed. He asked in a deep voice, who are you? Among the people present, there were several demigods and supreme existences in the tribulation stage. However, before this person spoke, no one had noticed his arrival. All this was enough to show that this person's strength was far above everyone present, and above demigods. There were only supreme existences. Chun Changxing's question was also the same question in everyone's mind. Who exactly was this powerhouse of unknown origin? Faced with Chun Changxing's question, Zadier laughed and said, you've been discussing for a long time just now, and you're still asking me who I am. Isn't that a little too strange? When everyone heard Zadier's answer, their expressions suddenly became extremely ugly. You're a powerhouse from the Void Empire. Lu Zi looked deeply at Zadier and said, the one who died last time was called Kasisna. You should be Zadier, right? Zadier looked at Lu Zi in surprise and said, you actually know me? Lu Zi's gaze was extremely solemn as she looked at Zadier. In a low voice, she said, Qin Chuan once told me that there are two demigods in the Void Empire. One is Kasisna, and the other is Zadier. Kasisna is dead, and the ethereal has fallen. Zadier will become the biggest winner and be promoted to rank 1. Upon hearing Lu Zi's words, Zadie chuckled and said, you're right. I was indeed the biggest beneficiary of that incident. Speaking of which, I still have to thank Qin Chuan. As he spoke, Zadier looked around and asked curiously, "Speaking of which, where did Qin Chuan go? I didn't find any traces of him in the surroundings." "If you're looking for Boss, then you've come to the wrong place. Boss isn't here. To be honest, we don't know where he went." Chen Changxing looked at Zadier and mustered up his courage to say this. He was just a mere Dongshu stage cultivator. It really required courage to face a powerhouse like Zadier. Upon hearing Chen Changxing's words, Zadier turned his gaze to Chen Changxing and said with a smile, "I can tell that you're not lying." Upon hearing Zadier's response, Chen Changxing asked, "So, your target should be Boss, right? Since he's not here, why don't you wait for him to come back?" Upon hearing Chen Changxing's words, everyone could not help but turn their gazes to Chen Changxing. They really admired Chen Changxing's courage. He actually dared to speak like this in the face of a powerhouse who could easily crush him, and an enemy at that. Just when everyone thought that Zadier would fly into a rage because of Chen Changxing's impertinence, Zadier scratched his head in distress and said, "But I don't know when Qin Chuan will come back. What if he comes back, hears that I was here, and runs away again?" Upon hearing Zadier's response, Chen Changxing could not help but be stunned. He looked at Zadier and asked in astonishment, "Then what do you want to do?" Zadier looked at Chen Changxing with a smile and said, "I'll wait for him here. I'll leave when he comes back." At this moment, everyone's expressions could not be any uglier. Zadier was going to stay? Upon seeing everyone's extremely ugly expressions, Zadier's smile became even more radiant. Unfortunately, his smile was covered by his hood, and no one could see it. Chen Changxing looked at Zadier and asked, "Sir, this place is simple and crude." "Simple and crude? I think it's quite good." Zadier looked at Chen Changxing and said with a smile, "Besides, I haven't finished my words just now. Not only am I going to stay, but I'm also going to kill." Kill. When everyone heard Zadier say the word kill, they subconsciously mobilized the energy in their bodies and prepared to fight to the death. No one knows if you will secretly inform Qin Chuan. What if he hears that I'm staying here and doesn't come back? Wouldn't I have waited for nothing? Zadier said with a smile. So, I'm going to kill every day. I'll stop killing when Qin Chuan comes back. At this point, Zadier looked around and said to everyone in a comforting tone, "But don't worry, I won't kill you for the time being. All of you are very important to Qin Chuan. Once I kill all of you, there won't be anyone who can threaten Qin Chuan anymore. In the first month, I'll kill some insignificant people. After a month, if Qin Chuan still doesn't appear, I'll start killing all of you." As soon as Zadier finished speaking, a green branch suddenly grew out of his body. The flower bud on this branch was about to bloom, and it looked very charming. When the flower bud bloomed and grew into a beautiful dark purple flower, Zadier's body could not help but tremble slightly, as if he was affected by something. Dream Manji is taking effect. Lu Zi was pleasantly surprised when she saw this. She quickly motioned for Zhou Lin to attack. As soon as Zhou Lin heard Lu Zi's words, she conjured a golden sword and flew toward Zadier, who was affected by Dream Manji. However, when Zhou Lin arrived in front of Zadier, Zadier suddenly raised his hand and caught the sword with 2 fingers. Seeing this, Zhou Lin and Lu Zi's expressions changed drastically. Zadier looked at the shocked Zhou Lin and said with a smile, "Are you surprised? Are you surprised? You all thought that I was bewitched, but I was just teasing you. After all, it's too boring to suppress you directly. It's more interesting to see you resist fiercely." Chapter 1389. Zhou Lin wanted to retreat when she heard Zadier's words, but a wisp of void power followed Zadier's finger and wrapped around Zhou Lin, trapping her in the blink of an eye. Great Baron Star fall. At this moment, Huang Feng suddenly roared. He raised his hand, and a huge meteorite fell from the sky and smashed toward Zadier. Facing the falling meteorite, Zadier only raised his hand and tapped it lightly. The meteorite suddenly exploded and disappeared into nothingness. God says that no one is allowed to control Zhou Lin. Saint Baudelaire, who had been silent since the beginning of the meeting, suddenly spoke. He wanted to use the power of absolute command to help Zhou Lin escape. When the power of the law of diction acted on the void force entangling Zhou Lin, Zetter merely sneered, and the power of the law of diction collapsed with a loud bang. Saint Bador was immediately seriously injured. His face turned pale, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. Whoosh! Phelon's figure suddenly appeared behind Zadier. He held a high-grade sacred longsword in his hand and stabbed at Zadier. However, just as the high-grade sacred longsword was about to pierce Zadier's cloak, cracks suddenly appeared on the sword. Crack! Phelon's expression changed when he saw the longsword in his hand shatter. Immediately, an extremely terrifying force acted on him and sent him flying. He crashed through the wall of the meeting room and smashed into the campsite. Bang! With a violent roar, more than 3/4 of the campsite was destroyed and turned into a huge crater. Phelon was lying in the middle of the crater, and he was already on the verge of death. When the crowd saw Tai Long's miserable state, their expressions became extremely gloomy. They did not even see Zetter make a move. Zetter had merely exposed a little bit of his aura, and it was enough to force Tai Long to retreat. He had almost killed Tai Long. Zadier's strength was simply too terrifying. It was not something they could contend against, even if they joined forces. Do you still want to continue? Zadier looked at the crowd with a smile and said, I've already shown mercy just now. If you want to continue this game, I'll have to be serious. Everyone felt extremely aggrieved when they heard Zadier's words. However, there was nothing they could do about it. When Zadier saw that no one was making any more moves, he released Zhou Lin's restraints. Zhou Lin took the opportunity to retreat, and Zadier did not pursue her. All right, I'll leave the cleaning up of the battlefield to you guys. I'll be staying in this conference room for the time being. You don't have to worry about me. I'll find my own food and drink if I'm hungry or thirsty. Zadier greeted everyone as if they were old acquaintances. Suddenly, he said, Oh, by the way, there's one more thing. If you see someone's head suddenly explode while you're walking on the road, please don't be afraid because I'm the one who killed that person. As he spoke, Zadier took out an hourglass from somewhere and placed it on the conference table. He said to everyone, When the sand in this hourglass runs out, I'll start to choose from among you to kill. So, please inform Qin Chuan as soon as possible and ask him to come back. The land of exile. It took Qin Chuan 10 days to finally walk through the 4,000 strange places in the Star Dragon Federation. Although there were many surprising discoveries, Qin Chuan did not find the holy prose he wanted. Without any reference, Qin Chuan even thought that he would not be able to recognize the holy prose even if he saw it. Dao runes were in the shape of strange characters, but the holy prose might not be the same. As early as 3 days ago, Qin Chuan had already received a message from Gao through the optical supercomputer. The coordinates of the strange places in the Realm Mountain and the Demon Realm had been sent to him. There were more than 6,000 strange places in the Realm Mountain and the Demon Realm. According to his traveling efficiency in the Star Dragon Federation, it would take him at least half a month to finish walking through them. I've already wasted a lot of time here. I'd better walk through the Realm Mountain and the Demon Realm as soon as possible. Thinking of this, Qin Chuan flew in the direction of the Realm Mountain and began a new round of traveling. At this time, it was already the 5th day since Zadier arrived on planet Iki. The number of people who died because of Zadier had already exceeded 10,000. In these 5 days, Zadier sealed off the entire planet Iki and did not allow anyone to enter or leave. Every day, he would randomly kill people. If he was in a good mood, he might only kill 1 or 2 people. If he was in a bad mood, he might kill thousands. The entire camp of the Division of Justice was filled with the smell of blood. An atmosphere of despair shrouded everyone. Ever since Zadier occupied the conference room, Chun Chongqing's residence became the place where everyone held their meetings. In these 5 days, they did not even take a single step out of this place. Everyone was frowning and feeling extremely miserable. More than 10,000 people have already died. Tian San sighed and said, In the past, Even when tens of millions of people sacrificed on the battlefield, I have never felt so heartbroken and helpless. I have even felt despair. The soldiers who sacrificed themselves on the battlefield fought to protect their families and their country. Tian people would naturally take good care of their loved ones and would not disappoint them. But now, the soldiers were living peacefully in the military camp, but disaster fell from the sky. No one knew when they would be chosen by Zadier and suddenly explode to death. In the face of such a situation, who could remain calm? I can understand everyone's feelings. Chun Chongqing helplessly said, "But Boss is in the dark universe right now. We can't contact him at all. If Boss knows what's happening around us, he'll definitely come back without hesitation. I believe he won't abandon us." When everyone heard Chun Chongqing's words, they all nodded. In the past, Qin Chuan had conquered everyone with his performance. Everyone knew very well that Qin Chuan was a person who valued friendship and righteousness. He would not coldly sit and watch the soldiers sacrifice themselves for no reason. However, Zadier's arrival was too coincidental. Actually, I'd rather Qin Chuan not know about what happened here. Amidst the silence, Saint Badur suddenly opened his mouth and said something that stunned everyone. Qin Chuan is only a demigod, while Zadier is an ultimate existence. Qin Chuan will only be throwing his life away if he returns. After Qin Chuan dies, Zadier will not let us go either. If Qin Chuan is still alive, even if we die, at least someone can avenge us in the future. But if Qin Chuan dies, who in this universe do you think will remember us and be willing to avenge us? When everyone heard Saint Bodil's words, they all fell silent. Just as Saint Bodil said, it was best if Qin Chuan did not return. If Qin Chuan must come back, then they hoped that Qin Chuan could only return after he was promoted to an ultimate existence. However, was that possible? Chapter 1390. Half a month had passed. Qin Chuan had traveled to all the strange places in the Realm Mountain and the Demon Realm, but he still did not find any traces of the Holy Prose. This made Qin Chuan feel that his judgment was wrong. Perhaps the Holy Prose was not in the Banished Land, but somewhere else. Qin Chuan did not give up and spent another 3 days looking around, but he still found nothing. Finally, he decided to leave the Banished Land and look for the Holy Prose elsewhere. However, before that, he was prepared to return to the outside world and contact the capital of Starting Point to ask Long Xiao to bring back the practitioners from the Center of Airs. When Qin Chuan left the Dark Universe and returned to the Sane Star system, he contacted Long Xiao. Before he could say anything, Long Xiao told Qin Chuan about what had happened recently in an extremely excited tone. Qin Chuan, a powerhouse from the Void Empire, came and destroyed the messy rock planet. He also sealed the Iki planet and trapped everyone. Qin Chuan's expression turned ugly when he heard Long Xiao's words. He asked in a low voice, "How long ago did this happen?" 22 days. Long Xiao replied, "I contacted Chongqing before, and he said that the opponent's target is you. If you don't go to the Iki planet within a month, he will start a massacre." Long Xiao paused for a moment and then said, "Oh right, that Void Empire powerhouse's name is Zadier. It really is Zadier." Qin Chuan gritted his teeth. He had already guessed that if another powerhouse from the Void Empire came, it would definitely be Zadier. However, he did not expect Zadier's arrival to be so coincidental. It happened not long after he left the Iki planet. "I'm going to the Iki planet now." Qin Chuan, "Actually, you don't have to go." Hearing Long Xiao's words, Qin Chuan was stunned and said, "How can I not go?" Long Xiao bit her lower lip with her pearly white teeth. After a long while, she said with some hesitation, "The other party is a supreme existence. If you go, you'll just be throwing your life away." Long Xiao's words caused Qin Chuan to fall silent. Zadier was already a supreme existence. If he went to Iki planet now, he would be courting death, but he had to go. If he didn't go, everyone on Iki planet would die because of him. After a long silence, Qin Chuan grinned and said to Long Xiao, "Although I also want to find a reason for myself, such as something like I'll definitely avenge them as long as I'm alive, I'll definitely be scolded as a coward if I do that. Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Long Zhao's voice was somewhat choked as he said, "Don't be rash. Only by enduring humiliation can we preserve the overall situation." All right, actually, I'm not someone who cares about things like reputation. I just want to go to Iki Planet and try my best to see if I can save everyone. If I don't go, I'll live in regret for the rest of my life. Trust me this once, okay? After saying this, Qin Chuan let out a long sigh and then hung up the call with Long Zhao. He began to use the space travel technique to rush to Iki Planet. Iki Planet. Zindir squatted on the conference table and fiddled with the hourglass in his hand out of boredom. Aya, there are still 5 more days before this month will pass. In the past, I've never felt that a month could actually be so long. While speaking, Zindir turned his head and looked at Grayson, who was tied to the chair. At this time, Grayson was closing his eyes and pretending to be asleep, as if he did not hear Zindir's complaints. "Hey, I'm talking to you. You don't have any reaction at all. Isn't that a little inappropriate?" Hearing Zindir's words, Grayson slowly opened his eyes and looked at Zindir. He asked, "What do you want to hear from me?" Zindir smiled and said, "Anything is fine. For example, guess whether I'll kill you or not." "I don't want to guess." Grayson looked at Zindir and said calmly, "Now that I'm already a prisoner, whether you want to kill me or not, I don't have any room to resist. Instead of wasting my brain to guess whether you'll kill me or not, it's better to cultivate quietly. The stronger I get, the more likely I'll be able to escape from you. This is the most practical thing." Hearing Grayson's answer, Zindir laughed and asked, "You're telling me your purpose so straightforwardly. Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you directly?" Grayson looked at Zindir and did not say anything else. He had already made his words very clear, and there was no need to repeat them. "That attitude of yours is really annoying." As he spoke, Zindir snapped his fingers. Almost at the same time, there was the sound of an explosion outside, followed by a low cry. Soon, silence was restored. Grayson knew that Zindir was killing people. Every time Zindir snapped his fingers, there would always be people who would suddenly explode and die. To be honest, in these 25 days, Grayson had completely recognized how temperamental Zindir was. No matter what Zindir did, Grayson would not be surprised. In Grayson's eyes, Zindir was a complete lunatic. If he was not a lunatic, he would not kill people for no reason. If he was not a lunatic, he would not be so arrogant in the territory of another supreme existence. Grey Castle could not wait to see the heavens intervene in the affairs of planet Iki. She did not believe that the heavens would just watch Zadie do whatever he wanted on planet Iki. If the heavens were to ignore Zadier's actions, then the heavens would become a laughingstock. Zindir looked at the indifferent Grayson and suddenly asked curiously, "If I kill a lot of Zerg's people, will you be sad?" Grayson did not want to answer Zindir's question. She hated the name Zerg, and she hated Zindir's mouth even more. When Zindir saw that Grayson did not speak, he asked with a smile, "Why don't you answer my question? Are you looking down on me? Don't think that I won't punish you just because we've known each other for many days." Grayson had had enough. Why was Zindir's mouth so petty? Was he really a supreme existence? Just as Grayson was filled with questions, Zindir suddenly turned his head and looked at the sky. He said in a surprised tone, "They're here." Grayson was shocked when she heard Zindir's words. Could it be that heaven had come? Just as Graychon was thinking about this, Zindir spoke again, as expected of the person whom you seize as a potential threat. To think that he already possesses such powerful strength at such a young age. If he is given a little more time, he might really be able to pose a threat to you. Qin Chuan. Grayson was very surprised. Qin Chuan actually came back. Did he come back to die? Chapter 1391. Buzz. A space portal slowly appeared in the sky above planet Iki. Qin Chuan, who had not stopped along the way, walked out from it. He immediately shrouded planet Iki with his mind power. When he found that Chun Chongxing and the others were safe and sound, he could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. But soon, Qin Chuan found that all the soldiers in the barracks were lifeless. Moreover, there were bloodstains everywhere in the barracks. The smell of blood was extremely strong. This guy. Qin Chuan clenched his fists and gritted his teeth. He guessed that Zadier must have gone on a killing spree in the barracks, resulting in the current situation, although he did not know what Zadier had done to the soldiers. In his heart, he had already labeled Zadier as a heinous criminal. The moment Qin Chuan's figure appeared in the sky above planet Iki, Chen Chongqing and the others also noticed Qin Chuan's return. They quickly left Chen Chongqing's bedroom and rushed to Qin Chuan's side. When they saw Qin Chuan's figure, their faces were filled with excitement, uneasiness, and guilt. "Boss, you came back in the end. I knew you would come back." Chen Chongqing looked at Qin Chuan with a complicated expression. He knew that Qin Chuan would definitely return to planet Iki for everyone. But from a selfish point of view, he really hoped that Qin Chuan could be selfish for once and not return to planet Iki. "Qin Chuan, I'm really sorry. We're useless. Every time there's trouble, you have to step in." Tianxin looked at Qin Chuan guiltily. He was extremely ashamed. Now, when the Tian people's territory was invaded, the Celestial Arch did not step in, nor did Heaven. Instead, it was Qin Chuan, his ally, who stepped in. This made Tianxin feel very sorry for Qin Chuan. In the face of everyone's shame, Qin Chuan chuckled and said, "Don't think that I'm selfless, and don't feel ashamed. Speaking of which, I should be the one who implicated everyone. After all, the other party came for me. Qin Chuan, what should we do now?" Luzi looked at Qin Chuan and transmitted her voice. "Can we use the interstellar teleportation formation to leave?" When Qin Chuan heard this, he looked at LVZ and sighed. He replied via voice transmission, "I can bring you guys away, but what about the billions of soldiers?" Hearing Qin Chuan's reply, Luzi couldn't help but fall silent. Yes, they were now by Qin Chuan's side and could leave through the galactic teleportation formation. But what about the billions of soldiers? If they all left, Zadier would definitely be enraged and kill everyone on planet Iki to vent his anger. "Leave it to me." Qin Chuan reached out and gently stroked Luzi's hair. "Wait for me to come back." As he spoke, Qin Chuan left the crowd and walked toward the conference room. When he arrived at planet Iki, he could clearly sense the presence of an extremely powerful aura in the conference room. It should be Zadier. Qin Chuan walked through the big hole in the conference room's wall and walked into the conference room. He immediately saw Zadier squatting on the table. Zadier was covered in a dark purple cloak from head to toe, almost exactly the same as Kashishan's. "You're finally here." Zadier looked at Qin Chuan with a smile on his face, as if he was an old friend who had not seen each other for many years. Qin Chuan looked at Zadier and said in a deep voice, "Your target is me. Now that I'm back, the others should be able to leave, right?" Hearing Qin Chuan's words, Zadier glanced at the crowd outside through the big hole in the wall and asked Qin Chuan with a smile, "You're already back and standing in front of me. Why should I negotiate with you about such things?" Qin Chuan took a deep look at Zadier and said, "If you're not willing to let them go, then I'll escape immediately and hide in a place where you'll never be able to find me. Once I've ascended to a supreme existence, I'll come back to you to avenge everyone." As he spoke, Qin Chuan had already opened a space portal beside him. He looked at Zadier and said, "In terms of attainments in the law of space, I believe that no one in the entire universe can compare to me. If you're confident that you can stop me before I leave through the space travel technique, then go ahead and attack." Hearing Qin Chuan's words, the smile on Zadier's face gradually disappeared. He looked at Qin Chuan with a somewhat gloomy gaze and asked, "Are you threatening me?" Qin Chuan shook his head and said, "Right now, I'm not qualified to threaten a supreme existence, or rather, a first-grade powerhouse. Therefore, you can take this as a presumptuous request of mine." Zadier laughed loudly, as if he had encountered something extremely happy. Qin Chuan remained silent as he watched Zadier's laughter grow louder and louder. The expression on his face was incomparably cold. "Interesting, this is really interesting. This is the first time I've met someone as interesting as you. As enemies, Shouldn't we just fight to the death when we meet? Why are you starting to make conditions with me? Zadier looked at Qin Chuan with a playful gaze. He slowly raised his hand and took off the hood on his head, revealing an ordinary face. If such a face was thrown on the streets, people would probably forget it in an instant after seeing it. There was nothing special about it at all. Do you see this face of mine? Zadier pointed at his pale face and said to Qin Chuan, use 10 human words to praise my appearance. If I'm happy, I'll agree to your request and let the others go. Hearing Zadier's words, Qin Chuan could not help but be stunned. Hui Chuan, who was sitting on a chair at the side, could not help but take a few more glances at Zadier. Although she had always known that Zadier was a lunatic who did not like to play by the rules, this time, Zadier had once again refreshed her understanding of Zadier. Zadier was not only a lunatic, he was also a narcissist. I'll only give you 1 minute. Zadier looked at Qin Chuan with a smile. You must seize this opportunity well. Qin Chuan glanced at Zadier with a subtle gaze and said, I hope that Zadier, who is handsome, elegant, dignified, majestic, talented, cultured, and refined, with a jade-like complexion, can spare everyone on this planet other than me. When the people inside and outside the conference room heard Qin Chuan's words, they could not help but show shame and anger on their faces. In their opinion, Zadier was blatantly insulting Qin Chuan. Ha ha, that's great. Zadier laughed loudly, his face full of pride after being praised. However, after laughing, he looked at Qin Chuan with a mocking gaze. Although I'm very satisfied, I regret it now. I don't intend to fulfill my promise. Chapter 1392. When she heard Zadie's words, Greywood, who was sitting on the chair, could not help but reveal an expression of I knew it. She knew that Zadie would not easily fulfill his promise. He must be toying with Qin Chuan. Everyone outside the meeting room was furious when they heard Chun Chongqing's words. Zadie was clearly toying with Qin Chuan and all of them. However, Qin Chuan did not seem to be surprised by this outcome at all. He looked at Zadie calmly and asked, Are you sure you want to break your promise? As he spoke, Qin Chuan's figure was already tightly pressed against the space portal. As long as he willed it, he could enter the space portal in an instant and leave Iki Planet. When Zadier saw that Qin Chuan was about to leave, he couldn't help but reveal a playful look on his face. He said, Did you really think that I was waiting for your praise and didn't do anything? Before Zettel could finish his sentence, boundless void energy suddenly surged out from the surroundings of the dimensional portal and sealed it in an instant. When the space portal was completely sealed by the void energy, Zadie slowly stood up and asked Qin Chuan, Now, what other tricks do you have? When everyone saw that Zadie had sealed the space portal, their expressions suddenly became extremely ugly. Originally, they thought that even if Qin Chuan could not save them, he could at least escape unscathed. However, it seemed that Qin Chuan had no way of escaping from Zadie's hands. Qin Chuan did not answer Zadie's question. He immediately retreated to the side of everyone in a flash. At the same time, a disc array appeared in his hand. The disc array emitted a faint white light. It had been activated. Qin Chuan raised his hand and threw the disc array in the middle of everyone, then flashed back into the meeting room. Before Qin Chuan could completely enter the meeting room, the white light from the disc array enveloped everyone. The next moment, everyone's figures disappeared from outside the meeting room. All of this seemed to take a long time to describe, but in reality, it all happened in the blink of an eye. By the time Zadie realized that something was wrong, it was already too late to stop the teleportation. Zadier glanced at the sky outside the conference room, and then turned his gaze to Qin Chuan. He asked, You knew that I would go back on my word, and that's why you were so calm. Moreover, you were prepared, and that's why you dared to come back, right? Zadier appeared to be very calm, but no one knew what kind of flames of anger were hidden under this calmness. That's right. Although I'm not a particularly smart person, I still have to make some preparations when facing an ultimate existence. Qin Chuan calmly said to Zadier, I deliberately opened a space portal to use it to attract all your attention. When you think that everything is fine after you seal the space portal and let your guard down, I can use the power of the formation plate to send everyone away. Hearing Qin Chuan's explanation, Zadier could not help but applaud Qin Chuan. He said, "Amazing, really amazing. In such a situation where there's such a huge disparity in strength between the enemy and us, you can still maintain such a calm mind. You're really amazing." At this point, Zadier paused for a moment and then asked curiously, "But there's one thing I'm curious about. Why didn't you leave with them?" "Because of the soldiers who are still in the military camp." Qin Chuan looked at Zadier. "If I leave too, you'll definitely destroy the entire Iki planet. Those 2 billion soldiers are innocent. I hope that they can all live well, walk out of the shadows of this period, and become cheerful again." Zadier was very surprised to hear Qin Chuan's words. He looked at Qin Chuan with a strange gaze and asked, "Do you really care about the lives of those lowly people?" Qin Chuan shook his head and said, "They're not lowly people. They're all humans, just like us." No, no, no. Zadier shook his head and said, "We're not humans, we're gods. I'm a god, you're a demigod. We're different from them. No matter what, I did stay for their sake." Qin Chuan looked at Zadier and said, "What will it take for you to let them go?" Zadier grinned and said, "Since you care so much about the lives of these people, why don't we play a game? How about it?" Qin Chuan looked at Zadier and asked, "What kind of game do you want to play?" If Qin Chuan had a choice, he would not be willing to use so many people's lives to play this game with Zadier. Unfortunately, he had no choice but to passively accept Zadier's arrangement. Zadier pointed at his feet and said to Qin Chuan, "I'll plant a seed on planet Iki. After 10 minutes, this seed will explode and the entire planet will be destroyed. If you can successfully hit me within 10 minutes, you win. I'll let everyone on this planet go. Oh, except for you." A game was a game, but Qin Chuan still had to be captured. Hearing Zadier's words, Qin Chuan pursed his lips and said, "I agree to this game." Zadier grinned and stretched out a finger, sending a dark purple ball of light into planet Iki's core. Then, he took out a new hourglass and placed it on the table. He said to Qin Chuan, "Now, the game begins." Before Zadier could finish his sentence, Qin Chuan's figure flashed and pounced on Zadier. He was extremely fast, almost like a beam of light, arriving in an instant. However, although Qin Chuan was fast, Zadier's reaction was even faster. His figure only moved an inch to the right, and he dodged Qin Chuan's attack. Qin Chuan lifted his leg and swept it across, but Zadier still dodged it calmly. Whoosh! A silver-white long sword suddenly appeared from the side and pierced toward Zadier. In an instant, it slashed hundreds of times at Zadier. However, Zadier was calm and unruffled. He moved around in the narrow space as if he was taking a stroll in the park, easily dodging every attack. Not far away, Greybeard looked at Qin Chuan, who was attacking Zadier wildly. She could not help but feel pity for him. In her opinion, unless Zadier was willing to go easy on him, Qin Chuan would never be able to hit Zadier. The gap between Qin Chuan and Zadier was just too big. Heavenly Demon Seal. Qin Chuan summoned the Heavenly Demon Seal, and the figure and dragon figures attacked Zadier together with the Milky Way sword. The terrifying momentum instantly turned the conference room into ashes, and the power wreaked havoc on the ground. Unfortunately, it still couldn't hit Zadier. It couldn't even touch the cloak on Zadier's body. Even so, Qin Chuan did not give up. He was still trying his best to attack. As long as he did not fall, he would try. Chapter 1393. In the starry sky, Lu Zi and the others stood together. Each of them had a complicated expression on their faces. Not long ago, they were teleported away from planet Iki by Qin Chuan's interstellar teleportation disk. They were out of danger, but Qin Chuan did not leave with them. Each of them knew very well that the reason Qin Chuan did not leave was because of the others on planet Iki. Qin Chuan, he's really too stupid. Tian-san sighed. He's a respectable fool. When everyone heard Tian-san's words, they did not know what to say. This time, Qin Chuan saved all of their lives. For some of them, this was not the first time Qin Chuan saved their lives. They owed Qin Chuan too much. They might not be able to repay him in this lifetime. What should we do now? Huang Feng looked at everyone with a complicated expression. They were out of danger now, but Qin Chuan stayed on planet Iki. If they abandoned Qin Chuan just like that, they would not be able to get over the hurdle in their hearts. However, if they returned to planet Iki, whether they could help Qin Chuan was secondary. The most important thing was that they would waste Qin Chuan's good intentions. Qin Chuan could send them away once when Zadie was not paying attention, but he might not be able to send them away a second time. We can't go back. LVZ raised her eyes to look at the crowd. Her face was expressionless, but everyone could tell that she was actually feeling very uncomfortable. Hearing Lu Zi's words, Zhou Lin pursed her lips and said, "Then what should we do? Go back to the capital of Starting Point, and wait for him to come back." Lu Zi turned her head and looked in the direction of planet Iki. Her eyes were filled with determination. Planet Iki. The battle between Qin Chuan and Zadier continued. However, rather than calling it a battle, it was more accurate to say that Zadier was toying with Qin Chuan one-sidedly. 8 minutes had already passed, and Qin Chuan had almost exhausted all his methods, but he still could not hit Zadier. He could not even touch the corner of Zadier's clothes. As the only spectator, this was the first time that Huicho saw that Qin Chuan actually had so many powerful moves. If Qin Chuan's opponent was someone below the realm of perfection, he would have definitely been beaten to death by Qin Chuan. If I were Zephyr, I might have already been defeated when Qin Chuan used Heaven's collapse of the 9 transformations of the Dragon Ball. However, even after Qin Chuan used Heaven's scale of the 9 transformations of the Dragon Ball, he was still unable to hit Zephyr. The gap between a demigod and a perfection existence is just too big. While Huicho was thinking about this, 9 minutes had already passed. Qin Chuan only had 1 minute left. At this time, Qin Chuan was already a little exhausted, but Zadier was still at ease. "You still have 42 seconds. Zadier looked at Qin Chuan with a smile. When he saw that Qin Chuan was still unable to touch him even after using all his strength, he was in a good mood. This also made him realize that not everyone in the human race was as abnormal as you. Qin Chuan did not seem to hear Zadier's words and continued to attack. However, at this time, his attacks were becoming weaker and slower. Even with the strength of a demigod, after continuous high-intensity outbursts, he would feel exhausted. "It's the last 30 seconds. Zadier smiled as he counted down for Qin Chuan. It was not because he was so kind as to remind Qin Chuan. He simply wanted to tease Qin Chuan and see how anxious Qin Chuan was. Huicho looked at Qin Chuan, who was gradually losing all his composure, and could not help but sigh. Qin Chuan was already hopeless. In other words, Qin Chuan did not have any hope of winning in the first place. "It's the last 20 seconds. Zadier calmly dodged a punch and elegantly circled Qin Chuan. He came up behind Qin Chuan and leaned over to Qin Chuan's ear, saying, "You don't have much time left. Think about it now. Is it really worth sacrificing yourself for these lowly people?" Qin Chuan turned around and punched, but he still did not hit Zadier. He seemed to have been broken by Zadier's words and roared angrily, "It's worth it." Hearing Qin Chuan's roar, Zadier laughed and said, "Since you think it's worth it, then take it that it's worth it. However, you still have 10 seconds left." 8. Qin Chuan suddenly swung his fist and used all his strength, but he could not even touch Zadier's expectations. 7. Qin Chuan controlled the galaxy sword to slash at Zadier's body, but Zadier easily dodged it. 6. Qin Chuan used the power of the law of space to imprison the space around Zadier. However, Zadier's body only paused for a moment before he regained his freedom. 5. Qin Chuan used the 7th transformation of the 9 transformations of the Dragon Ball, Sky Edge, but he still could not hit Zadier. 4. Qin Chuan used lightning evasion to instantly close the distance between him and Zadier. 3. Qin Chuan took out the Rune sword and brazenly stabbed it at Zadier's chest. 2. When Zadier retreated to avoid the Rune sword's attack, Qin Chuan roared, "Time reversal." 1. When the power of time reversal acted on Zadier's body, even though Zadier was already a rank 1 powerhouse, his body still involuntarily stagnated for a moment and returned to the position he was in a second ago. Pucci. The runic sword accurately pierced Zadier's heart and pierced through his body. In this game, at the last second when time was about to end, Qin Xuan made a desperate counterattack and successfully hit Zadier. When all this happened, the entire conference room fell into absolute silence. Qin Xuan and Zadier stood facing each other. Everything came to a standstill at this moment. At the table, Grey Chuan stared at Qin Xuan and Zadier in shock. When she saw the golden sword piercing Zadier's heart, she was completely stunned. She never would have thought that at the last second, Qin Xuan would actually find a glimmer of hope in a hopeless situation and hit Zadier. Moreover, Qin Xuan had stabbed Zadier's heart. Even if an ultimate existence was powerful, the heart was still one of its weaknesses. I won. Qin Xuan panted violently. His gaze was fixed on Zadier, his expression incomparably cold. Upon hearing Qin Xuan's words, Zadier slowly shifted his gaze away from the golden sword piercing his heart and turned to Qin Xuan's face. He looked at Qin Xuan with an extremely complicated gaze. There was shock, astonishment, and a sudden realization. No wonder you could rise so quickly and so amazingly. So the rune sword has actually fallen into your hands. Zadier's expression suddenly became very strange, as if he wanted to laugh, but felt that it was really difficult to laugh in the current situation. As a result, his expression became very strange. Chapter 1394. Zephyr did not expect Qin Xuan to take out the runic sword in the last 3 seconds. As the former owner of the runic sword, he knew the runic sword too well. If it were not for the sudden appearance of the runic sword, he would not have been momentarily distracted, and Qin Xuan would not have seized the opportunity to strike him with the power of time reversal. The runic sword. It's been too long since I last saw it. Zephyr gently raised his hand, as if he wanted to touch the blade of the runic sword. However, Qin Xuan suddenly exerted force and once again stabbed the runic sword into Zephyr's body, causing Zephyr to pause in his movement. I said I won. Qin Xuan stared sharply at Zephyr. He knew that it would be difficult to kill Zephyr with this strike, but if he did not pull the sword out, Zephyr would not be able to unleash much of his strength under the attack of the runic sword. This was his only chance to force Zephyr to retrieve the dark purple ball of light in the planet's core. He could not miss it. When Zephyr heard Qin Xuan's words, he suddenly sneered and said, "You're so noisy." As he spoke, Zephyr had already raised his hand and grabbed the blade of the runic sword. He exerted a little force and pulled the runic sword out of his body by an inch. When dark purple blood flowed out of the wound, he grinned at Qin Xuan and said, "Since you can't kill me, you'll have to be careful that I don't kill you later." Zephyr's attitude was very clear. He would never admit the result of the game. Although Qin Xuan had expected this, he still felt extremely angry when he saw Zephyr break his promise without any psychological burden. In that case, let's go. Go. Go where? When Zeder heard Qin Xuan's words, he was obviously stunned. When Qin Xuan took out a disc array, Zeder immediately understood what Qin Xuan meant. When he wanted to put some distance between him and Qin Xuan had already activated the disc array. A pale white light instantly enveloped everyone in the conference room and teleported them away from Planet Iki. In the void, a hazy light flickered, and the next moment, 3 figures appeared. Zadier looked around and frowned slightly. He did not say anything. He thought that Qin Xuan would teleport them into the ambush circle that he had set up in advance. But in the end, it was just to leave Iki Planet. There's no need to think about it. There's no ambush. I just teleported us away from Planet Iki. Qin Xuan looked at Zendil gloomily. This was a decision he had made in desperation. Only by letting Zendil leave Planet Iki would the others on Planet Iki have a chance to survive. You're really an idiot. Zadier sneered. Have you forgotten the void power I left in Planet Iki's core? Hearing Zadier's words, Qinchuan's expression changed slightly. At this moment, Zadier suddenly lifted his leg and kicked Qinchuan's chest. Qinchuan's body immediately retreated backward. At the same time, the rune sword that pierced Zadier's heart was pulled out. A large amount of blood gushed out of Zadier's heart. If such an injury appeared on a low-level cultivator, they might be on the verge of death or even dead. However, for Zadier, although such an injury would affect his combat power, it was still far from enough to kill him. Zadier did not care about Qinchuan. He raised his hand and gently waved at the wound on his heart. A large amount of void power surged toward the wound and healed the wound almost instantly. As a god, it would be too depressing if I were to die from such a method. Zadier looked at Qinchuan with a smile. He seemed to have forgotten the previous unhappiness and became cheerful again. Qinchuan gripped the rune sword tightly and looked at Zadier warily. In terms of strength, he was no match for Zadier at all. He could deal with Zadier earlier because Zadier was not serious. Now, Zadier was probably going to get serious. When Qinchuan thought of this, Zadier suddenly appeared in front of him and punched him in the abdomen without any warning. When Qinchuan's abdomen was hit hard, a gush of void power suddenly surged out and imprisoned his body in place. Immediately after, Zadier attacked again and hit Qinchuan's back with his elbow. Just 2 hits were enough to make Qinchuan vomit mouthfuls of blood. His aura was weak, and he looked like a dying man. Zadier looked at Qinchuan's forehead full of sweat and smiled coldly. I hate people like you the most. You pretend to be calm and righteous, but you're actually scared to death. Zadier reached out and grabbed Qinchuan's hair, forcibly lifting Qinchuan's head. He said coldly, "Remember, if you don't have the strength, it's best not to pretend too much." If it were not for His Majesty's request for Zadier to capture Qinchuan alive, Zadier would have killed Qinchuan just now. Not far away, Grey Castle saw this scene and could not help but sigh. She originally thought that Qinchuan had the chance to complete the magnificent feat of going against the gods and leave a strong mark in history. Now, it seemed that she had overestimated Qinchuan and underestimated Zadier, a first-grade expert. Let's go. Zadier used void energy to tie Qinchuan up, then prepared to leave with Qinchuan and Grey Castle. At this moment, Zadier felt something and suddenly turned his head to look toward the east. In the pitch-black universe, the shadow of a person slowly appeared. Its aura was long, desolate, and simple. Looking at the shadow, Zadier smiled coldly and said, "You finally can't help but stand up?" Faced with Zadier's cold smile, the shadow slowly opened its mouth and said calmly, "You can't take him away." The him that the shadow was referring to was naturally Qinchuan. Hearing the shadow's words, Zadier smiled disdainfully and said, "Firmament, if you really want me to let him go, why don't you just descend and talk to me directly? You're too arrogant if you want me to retreat with just your will." Firmament. When they heard Zadier's words, the trapped Qinchuan and Grey Castle subconsciously looked at the shadow. So this person was Firmament. In the face of Zadier's provocation, Firmament calmly replied, "My main body is on the way. If you're not afraid, you can wait for me for 3 minutes." Hearing Firmament's words, Zadier laughed and said, "We're all existences of the same level. Why should I be afraid of you? Besides, you want me to wait for you. So do I have to wait for you? Don't I care about my reputation?" As he spoke, Zadier had already carried Qinchuan and Grey Castle in the direction of the Holy Cluster. Only an idiot would stay where he was and wait for Firmament to come. Chapter 1395. Seeing that Zadier was about to leave, Firmament's shadow had no choice but to stop him. He raised his hand and waved it. An extremely mysterious force enveloped Zadier. Zadier sneered when he saw this. He countered Firmament's attack with the void energy. Then, he smiled coldly at Firmament and said, "I know that your real body should be extracting the void energy from Planet Iki's core. That's why you need some time. I didn't expect an old man like you to be like that little guy Qinchuan. You both like to show great mercy." All this while, Zadier had always believed that the strong should be lonely and pursue themselves. They should never be bound by other things. The so-called friends, the so-called benevolence, these were all useless trash that should be thrown away. Hearing Zadier's words, Firmament said indifferently, Zadier, the reason you can become a rank 1 powerhouse is that you stole all the power of the church. You have never experienced the entire process of transformation, so you don't understand. You don't understand. Firmament's words were like a sharp sword that pierced Zadier's heart. Firmament indeed did not understand because his strength came from the church. He did not rely on his own talent to cultivate. It seemed like he had reached the top in a single bound, but in fact he lacked a lot of experience and comprehension. This was a regret that he could never make up for in his life. It was also because of this that Zadier became unscrupulous and reckless after obtaining this incomparably powerful power. And now, Firmament was saying these words to him as if he had experienced it before. Although it did not hurt him much, it was extremely insulting. You're courting death. Zadier was furious. He was completely furious. He did not want to leave anymore. He stayed where he was. He wanted Firmament to pay a painful price for his words and actions. Whoa! All of a sudden, a large amount of void energy appeared around the Firmament's shadow. The void energy wrapped around the Firmament's shadow and instantly shattered the Firmament's shadow. I'll wait here for you to come and die. At the very last moment before Firmament's shadow collapsed, Zedier uttered these words with a gloomy expression. Upon seeing this, Qin Xuan, who was not far away, could not help but have mixed feelings. Whether it was compared to heaven or Zadier, he was far too inferior. In fact, he was not even qualified to be compared to the two of them. Who do you think is stronger, Chang Tian or Zadier? Suddenly, Huiqiu turned to look at Qin Xuan and asked a very special question. Upon hearing Huiqiu's words, Qin Xuan replied without hesitation, Zadi. Grey Castle was a little surprised to hear this. He asked curiously, why Zade? He just became a perfected being not too long ago. Qin Xuan turned to look at Grey Chong and replied, to be precise, Zadier is a rank 1 expert, not a paragon. It's just a title. That's secondary. Grey Castle continued to ask, you should answer my question. Why do you think Zadie is stronger? Qin Xuan looked at Grey Castle and did not answer this question. Instead, he asked, it's just a title. Is it worth your hatred for humans for so many years? Upon hearing Qin Xuan's words, Grey Castle could not help but frown slightly. He said, these are two different things. Rank 1 and perfected being were on the same level, so it was not a problem to call Zadie whatever you wanted. However, Zerg and the Sacred Ones were worlds apart. In Grey Castle's opinion, calling Zadie a perfected being did not have any other meaning. However, calling the Sacred One Zerg was an insult to them. Qin Xuan smiled and said to Grey Castle, actually, I had something to say that day, but I did not dare to say it in front of the Sacred Emperor. Only those who have the courage to face their past can be considered a true expert. At this point, Qin Xuan did not wait for Grey Castle to say anything and continued. Now, let me answer your question. Although Zadie has just advanced to rank 1 not long ago, don't forget that his strength did not come from his own cultivation talent. Instead, he stole the power of the arcane. In other words, Zadie is as strong as the arcane was back then. I think Zadie is stronger than heaven because I think the arcane was stronger than heaven in the past. Upon hearing Qin Xuan's explanation, Grey Castle finally understood why Qin Xuan said that Zadie was stronger than heaven. It turned out that Qin Xuan believed that the arcane was stronger than heaven. However, right after that, Qin Xuan continued, this is just a guess of mine because I don't know to what extent Zadier has control over the power that originally belonged to the Void Spirit, and to what extent he can use it. Grey Castle nodded and said, I understand what you mean. It's like a piece of clothing. The arcane would fit the arcane well. Although Zadie can wear it, it might not fit him. Perhaps it needs to be tailored to fit him. Upon hearing Grey Castle's words, Qin Xuan smiled and said, that's a good example. Upon seeing the smile on Qin Xuan's face, Grey Castle asked curiously, you are now Zadie's prisoner. If the arcane is defeated, I'm afraid you won't have a good ending. Aren't you afraid at all? Qin Chuan glanced at Grey Castle and said, You are also a prisoner. Aren't you afraid? Zadie won't kill me, Grey Castle said to Qin Chuan. I'm different from you. I'm not afraid of Zadie either. Qin Chuan smiled. It's not like I don't have any other trump cards. Upon hearing Qin Chuan's words, Grey Castle was very surprised. She did not expect Qin Chuan to still have a trump card hidden. Just as she was curious about what Qin Chuan's trump card was, a figure in blue flew over from afar and stood in front of Zadie. This person in blue had the appearance of a middle-aged man. He looked cultured and elegant, and his aura was restrained. He was unfathomable. The only person who could come here at this time and stand in front of Zadie so calmly could only be Arcane. However, Arcane's appearance did not look as high-end and classy as Qin Chuan had imagined. Instead, he looked like an ordinary person. That's right, an ordinary person. You're finally here. Zadie stared at Arcane with a sharp gaze. He looked as if Arcane was his nemesis who had killed his father. He could not live under the same sky as him. Arcane did not immediately respond to Zadie. He first glanced at Qin Chuan. After confirming that Qin Chuan's life was not in danger for the time being, he turned his gaze to Zadie and said calmly, Let him go, and I won't pursue the other things you did in the celestial cluster. Upon hearing Arcane's words, Zadie smiled coldly and said, If you want me to let him go, sure. Then defeat me and take him back from me. I've heard of you long ago. Today, I'd like to see how powerful Arcane is. Chapter 1396. Chang Tian sighed softly when he heard Zephyr's words. I've met Su Ling before. Compared to him, you're too inferior in all aspects. Zephyr's expression suddenly became extremely ferocious when he heard Chang Tian's words. A terrifying aura erupted from his body and enveloped this part of the world, causing the universe to tremble. The thing I hate the most in my life is when people compare me to that old man. Zephyr roared angrily. Void energy surged out and turned into a giant hand that blotted out the sky and grabbed at Chang Tian. Chang Tian did not dodge when he saw this and allowed the giant hand to land on him. However, the giant hand did not cause any harm to Chang Tian. It did not even make Chang Tian move an inch. Chang Tian looked at Zephyr calmly and said, Do you know that in my eyes, you're just a child holding a butcher's knife? Although the butcher's knife has fatal lethality, a child does not have the ability to fully utilize the butcher's lethality. Before Chang Tian could finish his sentence, the giant hand that was grabbing him crumbled inch by inch and turned into balls of void energy that dissipated. Zephyr was furious when he saw this. He hated Chang Tian to the core and hated Chang Tian's nonchalant attitude. The calmer Chang Tian was, the more he wanted to smash Chang Tian's entire face. Dying, Zephyr raised his hand and clenched it at Chang Tian. An extremely vast and mighty force was born from the unseen world and enveloped Chang Tian's surroundings. It turned into a wisp of dark purple smoke that exuded a terrifying pressure. Divine power. Almost subconsciously, this word popped into Qin Chuan's mind. Only the power of a true god could possess such an awe-inspiring aura. Chang Tian's expression finally turned solemn in the face of Zephyr's furious attack. Before the dark purple smoke came into contact with him, a faint white smoke had already appeared around him. While protecting Chang Tian, the faint white smoke was also expelling the dark purple smoke that was closing in on him. This scene looked ordinary, but Qin Chuan could see that there was a great terror hidden within. What puzzled Qin Chuan the most was that both the dark purple smoke released by Zephyr and the faint white smoke released by Chang Tian gave him an indescribable sense of familiarity. He seemed to have seen this strange power somewhere before. However, he really could not remember where he had seen this power before. At this moment, both Heaven and Zephyr had become serious. As their divine powers surged, Qin Chuan seemed to be able to see the birth and destruction of stars, the collapse and reconstruction of space, and even the acceleration and reversal of time. All of this seemed extremely mysterious, and one could not help but be mesmerized by it. Don't look! At this moment, a low shout suddenly sounded in Qinchuan's ears, waking Qinchuan up with a start. Greichuan looked at Qinchuan and said in a deep voice, "The battle between Chang Tian and Zephyr involves divine power. It's not something that demigods like us can easily explore. If you continue to watch, you might be lost in it for the rest of your life and never wake up again." Hearing Greichuan's words, Qinchuan looked at Greichuan with some gratitude and said, "Thank you." If Greichuan had not woken him up just now, he might really have been lost in it unknowingly. Hearing Qinchuan's gratitude, Greichuan coldly snorted and said, "No need to thank me. Don't forget we are enemies." After reminding Qinchuan just now, Greichuan finally realized that she and Qinchuan were enemies. When she saw that Qinchuan was about to fall into it, she should have been happy. Instead, she could not help but remind Qinchuan and save Qinchuan. Seeing the cold expression on Greichuan's face, Qinchuan smiled and said, "We are indeed enemies. I have killed many of your companions, and you have also harmed my companions. However, this does not stop me from thanking you for saving me just now. If we meet on the battlefield in the future, I will let you go once to repay your kindness." Qinchuan knew that the grudge between him and Greichuan could not be written off so easily. The problem was too complicated and difficult to solve. However, these were two different matters. He still had to repay the favor of saving his life. Greichuan did not continue the topic with Qinchuan. Instead, she changed the topic and asked Qinchuan, "How confident do you think heaven is in defeating Zendir?" Qinchuan thought for a moment and replied, "To be honest, I don't really understand a battle at this level, so it's not easy for me to make a judgment. However, I guess that it won't be easy to determine a winner between the two of them. It will most likely be a draw." "That's right. The smoke surrounding their bodies should be divine power." Greichuan nodded and said, "That is indeed divine power. It is also the reason why you're so obsessed with it. In this universe, there is no cultivator who can resist the temptation of divine power. It is a power that everyone in the world desires to control." When she mentioned divine power, Greichuan's face could not help but reveal a look of yearning. If nothing unexpected happened, it would not be long before he could control such power too. Hearing Greichuan's words, Qinchuan fell into deep thought. He felt very familiar with the divine power in the form of smoke. He should have seen this form of divine power before, but he really could not remember where he had seen it. At this moment, Greichuan spoke again. "The runic sword is a divine artifact, right? But I saw the runic sword in your hand just now. It doesn't look like a divine artifact." When Qinchuan had used the runic sword to assassinate Zendir, Zendir had mentioned the name of the runic sword. Thus, Greichuan knew that the golden blade in Qinchuan's hand was the famous runic sword. However, although the runic sword was a divine artifact, it looked very ordinary. Moreover, it did not cause much damage to Zendir. It did not seem to be very powerful. Greichuan had already known about the existence of the runic sword when he had met the Sage Emperor. Thus, Qinchuan had nothing to hide. He nodded and said, "That is indeed the runic sword," but at this point, Qinchuan suddenly stopped. Greichuan looked at Qinchuan and asked curiously, "But what?" Hearing Greichuan's words, Qinchuan exclaimed in a low voice and said excitedly, "I know. I remember now. I know where I have seen this power before." Greichuan heard Qinchuan's excited exclamation, and her face was full of confusion. What was Qinchuan saying? Why couldn't she understand? However, at this moment, Qinchuan was not in the mood to pay attention to Greichuan because he had already remembered where he had seen a similar power before. The land of exile, the carefree secret realm, the carefree residence. The green smoke in the mysterious portrait was almost exactly the same as the divine power that Heaven and Zendir had displayed. Chapter 1397. When he recalled everything, Qinchuan's mind replayed the scene in Carefree Residence like a flashlight. He entered Carefree Residence alone and saw a portrait hanging on the wall. The person in the portrait was dressed in white and holding a long sword. The person in the portrait disappeared, and the long sword turned into a wisp of green smoke that wrapped around the rune sword. For a long time after that, the green smoke had helped Qin Chuan many times. All this time, Qin Chuan had not figured out the origin of the green smoke. Later on, as Qin Chuan became stronger and stronger, the green smoke lost its use and had been lingering around the rune sword. Now that he recalled this matter, Qin Chuan was surprised to find that the green smoke had disappeared at some point in time. Be it Zadier's divine power or Firmament's divine power, they're no different from the green smoke in terms of form. Perhaps the green smoke is a type of divine power. Otherwise, it wouldn't have caused the rune sword to tremble. Qin Chuan frowned and looked down at the rune sword in his hand. If it weren't for what happened today, he would have almost forgotten about the existence of the green smoke. However, the green smoke had disappeared from the rune sword, so where did it go? Qin Chuan searched his brain and body, hoping to find traces of the green smoke. However, there was no result at all. Rune sword, do you still remember that wisp of green smoke? Qin Chuan had no choice but to ask the rune sword about the green smoke. He didn't know when the green smoke had disappeared, but the rune sword should remember. In the face of Qin Chuan's question, the rune sword quickly gave a response. A wisp of green smoke slowly emerged from the rune sword, and the green smoke wandered around the rune sword. It looked extremely mystical. However, this scene only appeared for a moment before it disappeared. Apart from Qin Chuan, no one else noticed this scene. When Qin Chuan saw the green smoke appear, he was somewhat surprised. So this green smoke has always been here, but you've hidden it. Speaking of which, what exactly is this green smoke? When Qin Chuan asked again, the rune sword gave an answer that made Qin Chuan somewhat confused. Divine prose. This wisp of green smoke was formed by the divine prose. Qin Chuan would never have thought that the divine prose he had been searching for had already been obtained by him, and was even under the control of the rune sword. However, since they had already obtained the divine prose, why didn't the rune sword tell him about it, or use the divine prose to heal its injuries? In response to Qin Chuan's new question, the rune sword responded once again. It was not that the rune sword did not want to use the power of the godly text to heal its wounds, but because this wisp of green smoke was an incomplete godly text, not a complete one. As for why it didn't tell Qin Chuan about this matter, it was because, strictly speaking, this wisp of green smoke was not a divine prose, so it didn't make much sense to tell Qin Chuan about it. After learning from the rune sword that the green smoke was an incomplete divine prose, Qin Chuan asked curiously, "Where is the remaining divine prose? How do we complete the divine prose?" At this moment, Qin Chuan was like a million whys, full of doubts and curiosity about everything. The rune sword responded to Qin Chuan's doubts and curiosity again. In order to complete the divine prose, they needed to find the other incomplete divine prose. The other incomplete divine prose should also be in the land of exile, but they had not been discovered yet. In fact, Qin Chuan's idea of looking for strange places in the land of exile could be said to be correct, but unfortunately, the remaining incomplete divine prose was not in those strange places. Perhaps, Qin Chuan should go to the carefree secret realm again. After we get out of danger this time, we'll go back and take a look at the carefree secret realm again. At this time, Qin Chuan could not wait to return to the land of exile and go to the carefree secret realm to see if he could find the new divine prose. By the way, do you know who the person in the portrait is? Qin Chuan was a little curious. Who was the person in white holding a long sword? It couldn't be that carefree man, right? This time, the rune sword did not respond, but Qin Chuan guessed some answers from the silence of the rune sword. That person is you, right? Qin Chuan pursed his lips, and a subtle look appeared on his face. Besides you, Qin Chuan could not think of any other answer. Thinking of this, Qin Chuan could not help but sigh. He realized that ever since he rose to power, he had been living in the shadow of you. Whether it was the rune sword, the talisman array, or even the power of law and the divine prose, all of these were inseparable from you. Yu's shadow was involved in all of them. He felt like he was Yu's shadow, walking the path that you had walked before. I want to know, is you also practicing the thunder-devouring scripture? I can practice the thunder-devouring scripture because my talent rune is thunder. Is Yu's talent rune also thunder? He should have time, right? Qin Chuan had too many questions in his heart that he needed someone to answer for him. No. This time, the rune sword responded. Yu's practice was not the thunder-devouring scripture. As for what Yu's practice was, the rune sword did not tell Qin Chuan. However, for Qin Chuan, this answer was enough. Fortunately, he is not practicing the thunder-devouring scripture. Otherwise, I would really suspect that I am his substitute. Qin Chuan smiled silently. However, he did not feel much relief in his heart. Instead, his mood became even heavier. Qin Chuan even had the urge to ask Zadier to take him away and go to the Void Empire to see Yu. He desperately wanted to see what kind of person Yu was with his own eyes. Qin Chuan and the rune sword communicated through their minds, so Huizhong did not know what Qin Chuan was doing at this time. In her eyes, Qin Chuan's behavior was extremely strange, like a madman. Huizhong looked at Qin Chuan, frowning, laughing, shocked, and worried. It was as if dozens of people were squeezed into Qin Chuan's body, showing different emotions. It was extremely strange. Is there something wrong with your brain? Huizhong looked at Qin Chuan and frowned slightly. She felt that something was wrong with Qin Chuan. Hearing Huizhong's words, Qin Chuan turned to look at Huizhong and said, I was thinking about something just now and was a little lost. I'm fine. With that, Qin Chuan turned to look at Song Tian and Zadier. Song Tian and Zadier's battle was still going on. It was still very dangerous. No one could tell who had the upper hand and who was at a disadvantage. Chapter 1398. Asterisk boom. Asterisk a dark purple ball of light the size of a thumb suddenly exploded beside Chong Tian. The terrifying impact was enough to destroy an entire galaxy. But Zedder had controlled such an astonishing destructive power within the narrow range of the machine, maximizing its lethality to the extreme. Freeze! Song Tian growled. Before the power of the explosion could spread, it was fixed in place. When Song Tian raised his hand and swept it across the area, the explosion disappeared without a trace. It was as if nothing had happened. What right do you have to freeze? Zadie growled, his face full of anger. The explosion that had already dissipated appeared once again in an extremely strange manner, as if time was flowing backward. Since you want to explode, then explode. Chong Tian snorted when he saw this. Immediately, the space around Zadie exploded, forming a huge black hole that wildly devoured everything around it. Zadie stood in the center of the black hole, but he was not affected by it at all. He stared at Chong Tian and said in a deep voice, Now, you've completely infuriated me. I'll show you my true strength. Chong Tian was unmoved when he heard Zadie's words. In the previous battle, Zadie had even displayed his divine force. How could he still hide his true strength? While Chong Tian was thinking about this, Zadie had already made a new move, Calamity's Descent. Following Zadie's bellow, Chong Tian immediately felt as if an extremely evil force had erupted in his body. It corroded his body without any warning, causing the divine force that was circulating freely in his body to show signs of stagnation. Witchcraft. Almost instantly, Chong Tian understood everything. He had always thought that Zadie was a rank 1 warrior. He had never expected Zadie to be a rank 1 magus. This was the first time he had seen a rank 1 magus with such a powerful physical body. In the previous battle, the wrong information that Chong Tian had gathered had caused him to be completely unguarded against witchcraft. As a result, Zadie's attack had succeeded, instantly reducing Chong Tian's combat strength by more than 30%. A 30% reduction in combat strength had a huge impact on the battle. While Firmament was using the divine power within his body to defend against the spell that had suddenly erupted, Zedder continued with a spurt of energy and cast another spell. Zephyr took out a mysterious yellow talisman. The purple talisman was engraved with some sinister and complicated gray words. Just one look at it was enough to make one feel extremely evil. Connect to the 9 underworlds. The evil spirits appear. As Zetter's voice fell, the purple talisman spontaneously combusted, turning into a pitch-black door filled with an evil aura in the void. The moment the door appeared, a series of hair-raising wails rang out. Then, raging resentment seeped out from the gaps in the door, turning into numerous ghostly faces that bared their fangs and brandished their claws. Qin Chuan and Huichio were shocked when they saw this scene. Zendir actually had the ability to communicate with the netherworld. All along, the 9 Nether had been a place that existed only in legends. No one had ever verified whether the 9 Nether truly existed. But now, Zendir had actually connected to the 9 Nether and summoned an evil spirit. Is this really the 9 Nether? Huichio found it hard to believe. In the past, she had always thought that the 9 Nether was merely an ancient legend, and that the 9 Nether did not really exist in the universe. However, from the current situation, the 9 Nether was clearly real. It was just that they had never come into contact with the 9 Nether. I don't know whether this is real or not. This is the first time I've seen something like this. However, from Zetter's confident expression, there's a high probability that this is real. The 9 Nether really exists. Qin Chuan looked at Zetter in shock. A rank 1 Magus actually had the ability to connect to the 9 Nether. This was too shocking. While Qin Chuan and Huichio were still in shock over the matter of the 9 Nether, Zetter had already slowly walked to the front of the door and reached out to grab the door knocker. Zetter looked at the sky, his expression extremely excited, as if something exciting was about to happen. Now, I'll let you witness the true power of a rank 1 Magus. The moment Zetter finished speaking, he suddenly pulled the door knocker forcefully and opened the tightly shut door. The moment the door opened, the ghostly wails and howls of wolves became extremely clear and loud. Countless evil spirits surged out from the open door. Each of these evil spirits had an extremely powerful aura. Even the weakest ones seemed to be at the peak of the combination stage. Under Zetter's command, they pounced straight at the sky. Faced with the tens of thousands of evil spirits pouncing on him in an instant, the sky, which was currently being troubled by witchcraft, had no choice but to take out a sacred weapon to block the evil spirit's attack. However, when the defensive sacred weapon was in front of the evil spirits actually crashed into the sacred weapon and devoured it completely in the blink of an eye. Qin Chuan couldn't help but reveal a wisp of shock when he saw this. A high-grade defensive sacred artifact hadn't even been able to endure for a second under the attacks of these evil spirits before it was obliterated. Even the sky had not expected such a thing to happen. The moment the sacred weapon was destroyed, the sky immediately tried to save it. However, these evil spirits had already rushed over without a care and directly surrounded the sky. These evil spirits are so terrifying. Huichio could not help but exclaim. This was the first time she had seen such a terrifying scene. The dignified sky, a supreme existence, was actually being entangled by a group of evil spirits. Moreover, there were still evil spirits constantly rushing out from the door and pouncing towards the sky. Now, the sky was completely submerged in the tide of evil spirits. Qin Chuan and Huichio could no longer see the sky's existence. They could no longer even sense the sky's aura. In their senses, evil auras were everywhere, and evil spirits were wreaking havoc. Zetter stood by the door and looked at the endless tide of evil spirits in front of him. He could not help but reveal a smug look on his face. If it was possible, he really wanted to see the expression on the sky's face. It must be shocked and angry, but there was nothing he could do. Ha ha ha! I've said it before. Everyone who looks down on me will have to pay a painful price. Even if you're the sky, a supreme existence, there's no exception. Zetter laughed wildly and unscrupulously. Just as Zetter was laughing, a pale white light suddenly lit up in the midst of the endless tide of evil spirits. Soon after, this pale white light filled this part of the universe. Wherever it passed, evil spirits turned into ashes. Chapter 1399. A stalwart figure stood in the center of the white light. His face was solemn, and his expression was dignified. His palms were clasped together, and he was focused and devout. This figure was Chang Tian, who had been attacked by the evil spirit tide. However, now that the evil spirit tide had been defeated, no matter how many evil spirits there were, they could not get close to Chang Tian. The moment they came into contact with the pale white light, they were turned into ashes. Heaven is virtuous. Evil spirits wreak havoc in the human world. They must be destroyed. Heaven stared coldly at Zendil. He was furious at Zendil for releasing the evil spirits. Facing the angry heaven, Zendil gritted his teeth and said, "You can actually destroy my evil spirit gate. Even a natural disaster has no effect." Zendil had expected heaven to have a backup plan, but he did not expect his 2 trump cards to be destroyed by heaven in an instant. At this moment, the evil spirit gate had already collapsed under the illumination of the pale white light. After the evil spirit gate disappeared, the pale white light also dissipated. The sky returned to its original state, looking ordinary and unremarkable. At this moment, Qin Xuan even felt that the heaven he saw earlier was the real heaven, and the current heaven was just an illusion. What technique did heaven use just now? Greatshu was a little puzzled. Could it be the power of oath? All along, the power of oath had been under heaven's control. It had always been mysterious, and very few people had seen it. Therefore, Greatshu could only suspect that the power just now was the power of oath, but he could not be sure if it was the power of oath. "I'm not sure what kind of power it is either, because I've never seen the power of oath before." Qin Xuan could not answer Greatshu's question. He even wanted to ask Greatshu what kind of power it was. "You deserve to die." Just as Qin Xuan and Greatshu were conversing, the furious Zendil had once again launched an attack on heaven. Speaking of which, this was the first time Qin Xuan and Greatshu had seen someone like Zendil. Other people would try their best to maintain their rationality in battle, calmly thinking about how to take each step and how to break the opponent's moves. However, Zendil would fly into a rage at the slightest provocation. He was so unreasonable that he did not seem like a sorcerer, but more like a warrior. At this moment, just by looking at the situation, those who did not know would think that Zendil was a barbarian who had long been exterminated. When he fought, he relied on brute force and never used his brain. However, such a person was so powerful that he could easily crush Qin Shu. And Qin Shu, divine power of the void. Zendil be heaven, earth, heaven. Streaks of void energy surged from all directions, turning this part of the universe into a deep purple color. The pressure was extremely terrifying. Under this terrifying power, Qin Xuan and Hui Qian could only tremble in fear. When heaven saw Zendil's actions, his expression turned cold. He said in a low voice, "Divine power of the vow." Following heaven's low roar, a touch of white suddenly appeared in the dark purple between heaven and earth. In the blink of an eye, this pale white color began to expand fiercely. In the blink of an eye, it occupied half of the space between heaven and earth. When the dark purple and pale white intertwined between heaven and earth, devouring each other, everyone in the celestial cluster raised their heads to look at the sky in shock. The originally clear sky had now turned dark purple and pale white. Under the sky where the 2 colors intertwined, everyone's faces were filled with horror. It was as if they were facing the end of the world. If there was anyone in the celestial cluster who could feel the power of the gods the most, it would definitely be Qin Xuan and Greatshu. This was because the 2 gods who were fighting were right next to them. They could feel how small they were in front of the power of the gods up close. "These 2 are going all out," Greatshu said to Qin Xuan in a trembling voice. "Now, the entire celestial cluster is affected by their power. Maybe after tomorrow, there will be no celestial cluster." Qin Xuan was shocked when he heard Greatshu's words. He said, "The entire celestial cluster is going to be destroyed? Is it that exaggerated?" Greatshu took a deep look at Qin Xuan and said, "Otherwise, why do you think the ultimate existences rarely take action? Once the ultimate existences really fight, the damage to the universe will be too great. Qin Chuan looked at the sky in the distance, then looked at Zendil and heaven. He asked, "So, these two are not going to care about the life and death of Heaven's star?" "No, Zendil doesn't care, and Heaven is trying his best to restrain Zendil." Grey Chu said to Qin Chuan, "With Zendil's strength, if he really doesn't care, he can completely turn the celestial cluster into ruins. As the ultimate existence of the Tian people and the actual ruler of the celestial cluster, Heaven will definitely not ignore the celestial cluster." Qin Chuan asked after hearing Grey Chu's explanation, "So, Heaven is now fighting against Zendil in order to protect Heaven's star. If he can suppress Zendil, then the celestial cluster will be fine. If he can't suppress Zendil, then the celestial cluster will suffer, right?" Grey Chu nodded and said, "Yes, that's right. From the current situation, the two of them are now evenly matched." Qin Chuan asked again, "If I want to help Heaven, what should I do?" Grey Chu turned his head and looked at Qin Chuan as if he was looking at a lunatic. He asked, "With your strength, how do you think you can help in a battle of this level?" Qin Chuan pondered for a moment, then asked, "What if I can reduce Zendil's divine void power?" "Perhaps it won't decrease by much." Grey Chu looked at Qin Chuan with some astonishment and asked, "Do you really have such a way?" Qin Chuan grinned and said, "I'm now bound. Even if I have a way, I can't use it. But I don't have a way, but he does." As soon as Qin Chuan finished speaking, a round golden ball of meat crawled out of his body. It was the little armored dragon. The little armored dragon looked at the dark purple and pale white sky and could not help but drool. Obviously, it was very eager to eat. When the little armored dragon appeared, Grey Chu was very surprised and said, "King of Sacred Armors? Is this your King of Sacred Armors?" The fact that Qin Chuan had a King of Sacred Armors was not a secret in Zerg. Although Grey Chu had heard many legends about the little armored dragon, she did not take it to heart. Now that she saw the little armored dragon, she realized that Qin Chuan's King of Sacred Armors was completely different from other people's Kings of Sacred Armors. In terms of size, the little armored dragon was enough to defeat a dozen other Kings of Sacred Armors. Chapter 1400. Are you sure he can really do it? Grey Castle glanced at Qin Chuan with some hesitation. The little armored dragon did not have any other special features other than its large size. Qin Chuan did not know whether the little armored dragon could do it or not. But when the divine power of Heaven and Zendir began to intertwine, the little armored dragon suddenly reacted. It seemed to be very eager to devour divine power. That was why Qin Chuan asked Grey Castle the previous question. "I don't know whether he is reliable or not, but I think there should be no problem." Qin Chuan glanced at the little armored dragon and said to it, "You can devour divine power, but only the dark purple ones. Do you understand?" The little armored dragon nodded excitedly. If not for Qin Chuan stopping it, it would have already rushed up. Seeing the little armored dragon nod, Qin Chuan said to it, "Then go. Remember to be careful. Don't be discovered." Without waiting for Qin Chuan to finish his warning, the little armored dragon flew out impatiently and pounced towards the dark purple divine power between heaven and earth. Grey Castle swallowed her saliva when she saw this. She suddenly had a premonition that perhaps Qin Chuan and the little armored dragon would create a shocking miracle. Under the expecting gazes of Qin Chuan and Hui Qian, the little armored dragon was like a brave warrior as it charged towards the void godly power that filled the sky. It opened its little mouth to the limit, and with a roar, it viciously bit down on the void godly power. A small gap appeared where the little armored dragon had bitten. This small gap was like a dot of ink on a piece of white paper. Although it did not occupy a large area, it was extremely eye-catching. He can really do it. Qin Chuan was pleasantly surprised when he saw this. Hui Qi was dumbfounded. She didn't expect the little armored dragon to have such an ability. She couldn't help but think of her own Sacred Armor King. When she wanted her Sacred Armor King to come out and take a bite of the void godly power, she found that her Sacred Armor King was trembling. No matter what she said, it wouldn't come out. It was so scared that it wanted to die. This made Grey Castle realize that not all King of Sacred Armor could be as crazy as the little armored dragon. She really wanted to ask Qin Chuan how he managed to cultivate such a brand new species like the little armored dragon. But obviously, now was not the time to talk about this, because the little armored dragon had already started to madly devour the divine power of the void. She really wanted to see to what extent the little armored dragon could reach. Although the divine power released by Zadier was almost endless, and there was a large amount of divine power constantly replenishing the battlefield, as the saying goes, an ant's nest could destroy a dike of 1,000 miles. What the little armored dragon was doing now was digging an ant's nest. Time passed by minute. After the little armored dragon had devoured a large amount of divine power, the speed of its devouring gradually slowed down. Moreover, some strange changes were happening to the little armored dragon's body. The little armored dragon's body, which was originally shining with golden light, was now slowly covered with extremely evil purple patterns. These purple patterns were faintly discernible, but the little armored dragon did not seem to be aware of them. I feel that your King of Sacred Armor should have a problem. You can't let it continue devouring. Grey Castle reminded Qin Chuan. Divine power of the void is not something ordinary. Devouring too much of it has its benefits, but there are also disadvantages. What Grey Castle could discover, Qin Chuan could naturally discover as well. However, he had already communicated with the little armored dragon in his mind, but the little armored dragon had no intention of responding to him at all. It also had no intention of stopping its devouring. In other words, the little armored dragon was now addicted to the process of devouring the divine power of the void and had already lost control. Grey Castle saw the ugly expression on Qin Chuan's face and guessed that the little armored dragon had already lost control. She turned her head and looked at the purple patterns on the little armored dragon's body that were becoming more and more obvious. She said to Qin Chuan, "It looks like it's about to explode." "I know." Qin Chuan growled. Of course, he could see that the little armored dragon's devouring had reached its limit and could no longer eat. However, if he had a way to stop the little armored dragon, he would have done so long ago. There was only to wait until now. Just as Qin Chuan and Grey Castle were getting anxious because of the little armored dragon, Zadie, who had been focusing all his attention on heaven, finally noticed that something was wrong. The little armored dragon's tiny figure that was madly devouring the divine power of the void attracted Zadie's attention. "I was wondering why I kept feeling that something was not right. For some reason, that old fellow Heaven had the upper hand. So it's because of you, you stinking bug." Zadie was furious as he watched the little armored dragon devouring the divine power of the void. He had always felt that something was very strange. Every time he released the divine power of the void, a small part of it would disappear. Now that he had discovered the little armored dragon, he finally knew where the problem was. "Umph." Zadie snorted coldly and flicked his finger at the little armored dragon from afar. Immediately, the little armored dragon's body flew out with a bang. It's still alive." When Zadie saw that the little armored dragon's body did not explode, he could not help but be surprised. With his strength just now, it was enough to kill an ultimate existence in the tribulation stage. However, he could not hurt the little armored dragon at all. This was too strange. Just as Zadie wanted to study the little armored dragon properly, Heaven took advantage of Zadie's distraction to launch an attack on him. He took the opportunity to increase his advantage and forced Zadie to temporarily give up on finding trouble with the little armored dragon and focus on dealing with Heaven. At this moment, the little armored dragon's mind finally cleared after being beaten up by Zadie. It had a bitter look on its face as it raised its chubby little hand and patted its round belly. Then, it opened its mouth and spat out a large amount of divine power of the void. However, the divine power of the void dissipated after being spat out by the little armored dragon and did not return to Zadie's control. On the other side, Qin Chuan and Huicho heaved a long sigh of relief when they saw this scene. Fortunately, Zadie discovered the little armored dragon at the crucial moment and interrupted the little armored dragon's devouring of the divine power of the void. Otherwise, the little armored dragon would have really exploded and died. Little armored dragon, come back quickly. Qin Xuan called out to the little armored dragon with his mind. This time, the little armored dragon finally responded to Qin Xuan and quickly returned to Qin Xuan's side. The little armored dragon looked at Qin Xuan with an aggrieved expression and said to Qin Xuan, "Ate until I'm full." Qin Xuan grinned and asked the little armored dragon, "How do you feel now?" The little armored dragon thought for a while and suddenly revealed a big smile on its face. It said to Qin Xuan, "I feel very good." Chapter 1401. It felt great. Qin Xuan was a little surprised when he heard the little armored dragon's answer. It almost exploded just now. How could it feel great? Grissom was also very surprised. It was the first time she had seen the king of sacred armors that could talk. She could not help but wonder if the little armored dragon was really the king of sacred armors. How did it feel great? Qin Xuan was very curious. Could it be that the little armored dragon had undergone a new mutation? Faced with Qin Xuan's curiosity, the little armored dragon ate its fingers and thought for a long time, but could not figure out how it felt great. Anyway, just felt great. When Qin Xuan saw that the little armored dragon could not come up with an explanation for the time being, he decided to stop paying attention to the little armored dragon. Instead, he turned his attention to the battle between Heaven and Zadier. With the little armored dragon's help, Heaven managed to establish a slight advantage. Although it was not a huge advantage, its influence on the overall situation of the battle could not be ignored. At this moment, Zadie was attacking Heaven with all his might in an attempt to seize the advantage. However, it was a very difficult thing to do. Qin Xuan looked at the battle in front of him and asked Grissom, "Are the two of them going to be in a stalemate like this?" Grissom shook his head gently and said, "This is also the first time I've seen a battle between two ultimate existences. I don't know much about it." Hearing Grissom's words, Qin Xuan asked curiously, "Is the battle between the two of them really that dangerous?" To be honest, on the surface, I really don't feel much about it. Although the aura and pressure displayed by the battle between Heaven and Zadie were extremely shocking and powerful, Qin Xuan had never seen before, he really could not tell what the danger was just by looking at the divine power of void and divine power of oath intertwining and devouring each other. Perhaps he was too ignorant. Hearing Qin Xuan's question, Grissom looked at Qin Xuan with a subtle gaze and said, "No wonder you had the guts to fight with Zadie just now. It turns out that you really don't know anything." Qin Xuan said humbly to Grissom, "Please enlighten me." Grissom turned his head and looked into the distance. He asked Qin Xuan, "What do you see at the limit of your vision?" Qin Xuan subconsciously looked into the distance. After a while, he answered, "It's a mix of dark purple and pale white." Grissom nodded and said, "Where you can see, it's a mix of dark purple and pale white. Where you can't see, it's still a mix of dark purple and pale white." It's not an exaggeration to say that no matter where you stand in the celestial cluster, all you can see is a mix of dark purple and pale white. The battle between Heaven and Zadie affects the entire celestial cluster. It's where we can't see and where we are insignificant. Hearing Grissom's words, shock immediately appeared on Qin Xuan's face. Without waiting for him to speak, Grissom continued, "I didn't make myself clear earlier. I said that the battle between Heaven and Zadie might destroy the celestial cluster and that the celestial cluster would cease to exist tomorrow. In your understanding, it might be that after Zadie defeated Heaven, he would spend some time to conquer the entire celestial cluster. But what I said only happened in an instant." Grissom took a deep look at Qin Xuan and said, "Simply put, if Zadie has the upper hand, the celestial cluster will be destroyed in an instant. Whether it's you, me, your rescued friends, or even Stansos and the city of Starting Point, we will all be destroyed at the same time." When he heard Hui Qian's extremely detailed explanation, Qin Xuan couldn't help but open his eyes wide, and a wisp of shock appeared on his face. He'd originally thought that disappearing the entire Heaven Star cluster in a single day was already exaggerated enough, but in reality, it only took an instant. In other words, we don't even have a chance to escape. Qin was really shocked. He always thought that even if he died, as long as Chun Chongqing and Lu Zi were still alive, there would still be hope for the humans and demons in the city as starting point. At worst, they could just retreat back to the land of exile. Before Zadie made his move, everyone would still have a chance to escape. But now, it seemed that he had thought too much and underestimated the existence of ultimate existences. The power of ultimate existences had really exceeded the limits of Qin imagination. No, I can't let Zadie win. Originally, Qin did not particularly care about the outcome of the battle between Zadie and Heaven. He thought that even if Zadie won, he would be the only one to die. However, if Zadie won, the celestial cluster would be completely destroyed in an instant. Then, he would have to find a way to stop Zadie from winning. What other ways do you have to stop Zadie? Grissom looked at Qin, her eyes full of curiosity. To be honest, Qin's endless tricks did not look like a demigod. She really could not imagine how powerful Qin would be if he became an ultimate existence. Perhaps he would be like you during the Lost Era, becoming the strongest person in the era. Qin did not know what else he could do, but he had to do something. When he looked at Little Armor Dragon again, Little Armor Dragon, who had eaten its fill, had already begun to doze off and was about to fall asleep. Little Armor Dragon, can you still devour some more void divine power? Qin looked at Little Armor Dragon expectantly. Now, Little Armor Dragon was the only one he could rely on. Hearing Qin's words, Little Armor Dragon raised its eyelids slightly and looked at Qin, then said, "I'm full, sleepy." Qin heard it and said helplessly, "But if you can't devour more void divine power, we might all die." As he said that, Qin looked at the place where the void divine power and the void divine power intertwined. It seemed that Zadie had already regained some of his advantages. Will we die? Although Little Armor Dragon was not afraid of anything, it was still very resistant to things like death. It bit its finger and thought for a while, then said to Qin, "I can't control it." Qin was stunned. Control it? Control who? Little Armor Dragon glanced at the void divine power that pervaded its surroundings, and then gently pulled with its chubby little hand. A small amount of void divine power was pulled over, and it turned into a small ball of light in its hand. At the same time, dark purple patterns once again appeared on Little Armor Dragon's body. Seeing this scene, Qin and Huizhong both stared with wide eyes. There was actually such a thing? How much can you control? Qin swallowed a mouthful of saliva and asked curiously. He felt that his heart was about to jump out of his throat. Hearing Qin's question, Little Armor Dragon simply spread its 5 chubby fingers to the extreme, then fiercely tore off a large piece of void divine power. Just this much. Chapter 1402. Qin and Huichong watched as the Little Armor Dragon continuously kneaded and compressed a large ball of void god energy. Then it turned into a large ball of void god energy that it hugged in its arms. They were completely stunned. Since when did the Little Armor Dragon, king of sacred armor, possess such an ability? Qin glanced at the dark purple stripes on the Little Armor Dragon's body and asked curiously, "Is it this unique pattern that granted you this ability?" The Little Armor Dragon thought for a moment, then shook its head and said, "I don't know. This little thing, is it really the king of sacred armor?" Huicho hesitated for a long time, then finally asked Qin his question. The Little Armor Dragon was really too powerful. Qin grinned when he heard this. Just as he was about to speak, Zadie suddenly roared from afar. "It's you again. It's you again, you stinking bug." Zadie was unable to restrain his anger. He glared at the Little Armor Dragon and the ball of void divine power in its arms. He really hated the Little Armor Dragon. Hearing Zadie's angry scolding, Heaven also turned his gaze to the little armored dragon and focused on the ball of void divine power in the little armored dragon's arms. The expression on his face was very subtle. Previously, he was able to gain the upper hand because of the little armored dragon's help. Now that the little armored dragon had helped him gain an even greater advantage, he was naturally more happy. Seeing that Zadie was going to target the little armored dragon again, Heaven immediately increased the intensity of his attacks, forcing Zadie to devote himself to defense and temporarily have no time to take care of the little armored dragon. Qin Xuan saw that Zadie was forced by Heaven to the point that he had no way to take care of the little armored dragon. He could not help but let out a long sigh of relief and said to the little armored dragon, "Well done." The little armored dragon heard Qin Xuan's praise and smiled foolishly. Then it pointed at the ball of void divine power in its arms and asked, "What about it?" Qin Xuan glanced at the ball of void divine power and asked, "Can you disperse it?" The little armored dragon shook its head. If it dispersed the ball of void divine power, it would return to Zadie's control. Although the little armored dragon could cut off the connection between the ball of void divine power and Zadie by swallowing it, it really could not swallow it now. Qin Xuan saw the little armored dragon shaking its head and asked again, "Then can you keep holding it like this without letting go?" The little armored dragon replied, "Only for a little while." Qin Xuan heard this and glanced at Heaven, who was gradually gaining the upper hand and stabilizing the situation. He said to the little armored dragon, "A little while is enough." As long as Heaven could maintain its advantage, it would not affect the overall situation even if they released the void god power back to where it came from. At this moment, it was already impossible for Zdir to turn the situation around. If this stalemate continued, he might have to pay a huge price to retreat. Thinking of this, although Zadie was filled with hatred, he could only retreat temporarily for the sake of the overall situation. Whoosh! Zadie's figure flashed and appeared beside Qin Xuan. Just as he was about to reach out and grab Qin Xuan's arm to take Qin Xuan away, a pale white light suddenly approached from afar and arrived in front of him in the blink of an eye. If Zadie still wanted to capture Qin Xuan, he would definitely be hit by the divine power of Oath. Left with no choice, Zadie could only give up on capturing Qin Xuan. However, as soon as he retreated, Heaven came to Qin Xuan's side and protected Qin Xuan. At the same time, it also removed the restriction on Qin Xuan's body. At this time, it would be difficult for Zadie to capture Qin Xuan again. "Damn, old man." Zadie gritted his teeth and said angrily, "I'll be back." Before he finished speaking, Zadie's figure had already disappeared. The next moment, the dark purple that filled the sky receded like the tide, and pale white light completely occupied the entire space. After confirming that Zadie had retreated, Heaven said to Qin Xuan, "All right, it's fine now. He's gone." Qin Xuan immediately said to Heaven, "Thank you for saving me, Senior." Heaven looked at Qin Xuan and smiled. "You don't have to thank me. You should thank yourself." Qin Xuan was stunned and asked in confusion, "Thank myself?" Heaven nodded gently and said, "Actually, when Zadie appeared in the celestial cluster, I had already noticed him. He destroyed Messy Rockstar too quickly, so I didn't have time to stop him. Later, when he came to attack Planet Iki and captured everyone on Planet Iki, if I attacked Zadie directly, the people on Planet Iki would definitely suffer heavy casualties. Therefore, I have been holding back until you returned and teleported Zadie away from Planet Iki. Only then did I have the chance to resolve the crisis on Planet Iki and rush over to save you." At this point, Heaven paused for a moment, then turned his gaze to the little armored dragon squatting on Qin Xuan's shoulder. He said with some surprise, "In the end, it was also this little guy who helped me secure victory. Otherwise, the victor between Zadie and I would have been unknown." Hearing Heaven's words, the little armored dragon puffed out its chest proudly, then accidentally pushed out the big ball of void divine power. Seeing that the big ball of void divine power was about to explode, Heaven waved his hand and strangled this accident. "Senior, although what you said makes sense, I still have to thank you." In front of Heaven, Qin Chuan acted like an obedient child and did not dare to claim credit. Heaven did not care about Qin Chuan's insistence on thanking him. Compared to that, he cared more about the runic sword in Qin Chuan's hand. Heaven lowered his head and glanced at the runic sword in Qin Chuan's hand. He said, "This must be the famous god artifact runic sword from ancient times. However, it seems to have been severely injured and its spirituality has been greatly damaged." Now that the runic sword had been exposed, Qin Chuan had no intention of hiding it. He nodded and said to Heaven, "This is indeed a runic sword, but it can't be considered a god artifact anymore." Heaven glanced at Qin Chuan in a subtle manner and asked, "Back then, you searched everywhere for runes and absorbed their power to repair the runic sword, right? I've heard the Heavenly Emperor mention before that you were searching for divine runes. The key to repairing the runic sword must be the divine runes." Qin Chuan nodded honestly. He said, "That's right. I'm searching for divine runes, but I've already made some progress." After this incident, Qin Chuan prepared to return to the land of exile and go to the unfettered secret realm to see if he could find the incomplete divine runes again. Heaven nodded gently, then took out a white stone and handed it to Qin Chuan. He said, "Take this. If Zadie appears near you again, this stone will warn you." Qin Chuan was overjoyed when he heard this and immediately took the stone. "Thank you, Senior." Chapter 14:03. After the deep purple and pale white between heaven and earth receded, everyone in the heaven star cluster felt a sense of relief. Everyone had a relieved expression on their faces. What happened just now? Chen Changxing's face was pale and covered in cold sweat. As a Dongshu stage cultivator, he felt that he was only one step away from death. Lu Zi looked in the direction of planet Iki with a grave expression and said in a low voice, "The situation just now should have something to do with Zadie. He should be fighting with another expert." Hearing Lu Zi's words, Chen Changxing was very surprised and said, "Isn't the person who can fight with Zadie a paragon? Could it be Chang Tian? We can't rule out that possibility." Zhou Lin turned her gaze to Tian San and asked, "Can you determine if the expert fighting with Zadie is Chang Tian?" When everyone heard Zhou Lin's words, they all turned their heads to look at Tian San, waiting for his answer. Tian San nodded and said, "That expert that fought Dyer was indeed Firmament. Moreover, it was Firmament who obtained victory in the end." Hearing Tian San's answer, everyone was pleasantly surprised. If Chang Tian won, didn't that mean that Zadie was defeated? If that was the case, planet Iki should be safe now. Then Boss should be safe now, right? Chen Changxing asked impatiently. Ever since they were teleported away from planet Iki, he had been worried about Qin Chuan all the time. Now that he heard that Chang Tian had defeated Zadie, he was naturally most concerned about Qin Chuan's situation. Just as Chen Changxing asked this question, Lu Zi's optical computer suddenly received a message. The sender was Qin Chuan. Lu Zi took a look at the message and said excitedly to everyone, "Qin Chuan is fine. He asked for my coordinates just now and is coming to find us." Hearing Lu Zi's words, Chen Changxing immediately cheered like a child. Everyone's faces also showed joyful smiles. To them, Qin Chuan being fine was definitely the best thing. Everyone discussed what happened just now. Not long after, a space portal appeared beside Lu Zi and Qin Chuan's figure slowly walked out. He smiled and said to everyone, "Hello everyone, we meet again." Seeing Qin Chuan appear, Chen Changxing was so excited that he wanted to hug Qin Chuan. However, someone was faster than him. Lu Zi was the first to jump into Qin Chuan's embrace. Beside Chen Changxing, the enchanting and impulsive figure stopped, and a gloomy expression on her face. Qin Chuan gently hugged Lu Zi, then smiled and said to everyone, "I'm fine. You don't have to worry about me." At this time, Lu Zi, who buried her face in Qin Chuan's chest, raised her head and smiled shyly. Then she said to everyone, "I've confirmed that Qin Chuan is fine." Hearing Lu Zi's words, everyone laughed. No one would make fun of Lu Zi for this kind of thing. On the other hand, Chen Changxing noticed what happened just now. but after being glared at, he decided to shut his mouth and not say anything. Qin Chuan, what happened after you sent us away? Tian-san was the one who was most concerned about this matter. After all, the appearance of heaven was a big matter. He had to ask clearly. Qin Chuan smiled and briefly told everyone what happened after they left. When Qin Chuan said that Zadie wanted to use the lives of everyone on I-Chi Planet to play a 10-minute game with him, everyone could not help but be on tenterhooks. Under that kind of situation, Qin Chuan must have been in a very difficult position. He did not want to play any games, but he had no choice but to play along. When everyone heard Qin Chuan say that he had hit Zadie in the last second of the 10 minutes, they were all shocked. Even though Qin Chuan had used the first 9 minutes and 59 seconds to lay the groundwork for this last second to hit Zadie, it was still Zadie they were talking about. He was a dignified rank 1 expert, an ultimate existence. It was already extremely rare for Qin Chuan to hit him once. They could not hope for more. After that, when everyone heard Qin Chuan say that Zadie had once again broken his promise, they were all furious. They all felt that someone like Zadie was not worthy of being called an ultimate existence. He was a disgrace among ultimate existences, a scum. After that, Qin Chuan teleported Zadie away from I-Chi Planet with the help of the formation plate to buy time for Heaven to rescue I-Chi Planet. After that, Heaven fought Zadie and the celestial cluster was almost destroyed. Everything that happened was shocking. Such an experience was too legendary and too shocking. That's about it. Actually, I didn't do anything. I was just watching the battle. After Qin Chuan finished speaking, he could not help but sigh. Such an experience, such a thing. If he had not experienced it personally, he would not even dare to think about it. Qin Chuan, you don't have to belittle yourself. Everyone saw the effort you put in. If it weren't for you, everyone might not have been able to leave here alive. Huang Feng looked at Qin Chuan and said emotionally, to be honest, I've never really admired anyone in my life. You're definitely the first person who I admire from the bottom of my heart. Yes, Qin Chuan, you don't have to be humble. If you're so humble, we won't be able to live anymore. Thelon looked at Qin Chuan and laughed. Surviving a disaster always made people happy. Qin Chuan smiled and said to everyone, I'm not being humble. You can't expect me to brag too much, right? That would be too embarrassing. You also have times when you feel embarrassed? Chen Chongqing pretended to be surprised and said, Boss, you weren't like this in the past. If you had the chance to boast about yourself, you would definitely spare no effort. When Qin Chuan heard this, he glared at Chen Chongqing and said, You're already so old, yet you talk too much. Everyone laughed when they heard that. They felt that the way Qin Chuan and Chen Chongqing scolded each other was very amusing. At this moment, on the other side of the universe, someone could not bring himself to laugh. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Zephyr was furious. He poured his power into the universe as if he was venting his anger, shattering space and destroying the black hole. Originally, he already had victory in his grasp and would soon be able to defeat Chang Tian. However, the appearance of the little armored dragon disrupted his rhythm time and time again, giving Chang Tian the opportunity to seize the upper hand, causing him to lose the entire game. He should not have tried to capture Qin Chuan. He should have killed the little armored dragon with one slap. Now that he had left the battlefield, the more Zephyr thought about it, the angrier he became. He wanted to take revenge on Heaven, on Qin Chuan, and most importantly, on the little armored dragon. Zephyr immediately prepared to return to the Sage Monarch continent and contact the Saint Emperor. He wanted to join forces with the Saint Emperor to deal with Heaven and regain the face he had lost. Chapter 1404. When everyone proposed to return to the capital of Starting Point, Qin Chuan did not follow them. Instead, he went to the Banished Land alone. He could not wait to return to the Banished Land and go to the unfettered secret territory to see if he could find other incomplete divine prose. After Qin Chuan left the team, he went straight to the Banished Land. Qin Chuan did not see anyone when he came back this time. With his current strength he could already lock onto the existence of the unfettered secret territory in the banished land and enter it easily. The restriction effect of the unfettered secret territory on the realm had also lost its effect on Qinchuan. After entering the unfettered secret territory, Qinchuan took out the rune sword and asked, "Rune sword, can you sense the existence of other incomplete divine prose?" The rune sword responded after a moment of silence. In the east, after receiving the rune sword's response, Qinchuan immediately flew towards the east. After a while, the rune sword left Qinchuan's hand and fell down. Seeing this, Qinchuan also fell down. At this time, they had already arrived at an unexplored area of the unfettered secret territory. It was a huge forest. In the deep forest, there were many birds and beasts. When Qinchuan and the rune sword landed, they scattered in all directions. The rune sword ignored those fleeing birds and beasts and directly landed in front of a stone tablet that was half buried in the ground. This stone tablet had been buried here for many years. The words on it had long been weathered and could not be read clearly. Bang! The runic sword slashed at the stone tablet, shattering it. The moment the stone tablet shattered, a faint green smoke flew out from the stone tablet and attached itself to the runic sword. The green smoke that was originally lingering around the rune sword appeared at the same time. The two green smoke merged together and looked much stronger. When Qinchuan saw this, he couldn't help but reveal a wisp of joy. He said to the runic sword, "Let's go and continue searching for the next incomplete divine text." Under the guidance of the rune sword, Qinchuan found 6 more incomplete divine runes in the carefree secret realm. When the 6 incomplete divine runes merged with the previous incomplete divine runes, they turned into a blurry divine rune. Qinchuan looked at the blurry holy text and asked the rune sword in confusion, "Why does this holy text look so blurry? And there doesn't seem to be anything special about it." The rune sword responded to Qinchuan's question. The reason why the divine text looked blurry was because it was only half a line of divine text. It was still incomplete. After receiving the rune sword's response, Qinchuan was stunned. He asked again, "Are there any more incomplete runes in the carefree secret realm?" The rune sword responded, "There were no more incomplete divine runes in the carefree secret realm. All of the incomplete divine runes that could be found in the carefree secret realm were already here. As for the land of exile outside the carefree secret realm, there were no more incomplete divine runes." After receiving the rune sword's response, Qinchuan couldn't help but frown. If there was only half a line of divine text, it didn't seem to be of any use. Where should I go to find the other half of divine text? Qinchuan was having a headache. He had thought that he would be able to collect the complete set of divine text this time. He didn't expect that there would only be half of it. It was no wonder that the rune sword hadn't told him about the divine text. Even if it had, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. Half a line of divine text. It's better than nothing. Qinchuan comforted himself. Since there was no more divine text in the land of exile, it was time for him to return to the city of beginnings and make plans. Sage Monarch Continent. After returning to the Sage Monarch Continent, the first thing Zadier did was go to the Sage Palace at the peak of Sagely Mountain to find the Saint Emperor, who was currently meditating. The Saint Emperor looked at the ashen-faced Zadier and asked, "Why did you come back by yourself? Where's Huaishou?" Zadier snorted coldly. "I don't know where Huaishou is. Maybe he's dead, or maybe he's still alive." The Saint Emperor wasn't angry at all. After all, he knew that Huaishou was still alive. As soon as Huaishou had escaped, he had contacted the Saint Emperor and told him about what had happened in the Celestial Cluster. The Saint Emperor had asked Zadier this question because he wanted to use this opportunity to shut Zadier up. However, Zadier didn't fall for it. "Come with me. We're going to slaughter Azure Heaven," Zadier said domineeringly. He didn't even consider whether the Saint Emperor would agree to his request. The Saint Emperor looked at Zadier calmly. "I'm an existence on the same level as you. Aren't you looking down on me a little too much?" Zadi laughed coldly when he heard the Saint Emperor, and he said, "What? Do you think there's something wrong with the way I speak?" Without waiting for the Saint Emperor to reply, Zadier continued. Then why don't I have you come back and have a good chat with you? Zadier was indeed helpless against the Saint Emperor. However, this time, Zadier wasn't representing himself. He was representing you, who was standing behind him. Zadier didn't believe that the Saint Emperor would be able to remain so calm in front of you. However, Zadier was wrong. The Saint Emperor didn't fall for it either. If you can come, I'd like to meet him. I'd like to see the glory of the most powerful person in the universe in the ancient times. When he heard the Saint Emperor's words and saw the calm expression on his face, Zadier's expression suddenly changed. You're not afraid of you? He asked in a gloomy voice. The sage emperor smiled and asked, Would you be afraid of a person locked up in a cage? Zadier stared deeply at the Saint Emperor. How do you know about this? He asked in a deep voice. He didn't expect the Saint Emperor to know that you couldn't leave the Void Empire. The Saint Emperor looked at Zadier with a subtle gaze. I was just guessing at first. I wasn't too sure. However, your reaction made me realize that I was right. Zadier was furious when he heard the Saint Emperor's words. Are you trying to trick me? The Saint Emperor looked at Zadier's pale face and said indifferently, You can interpret it that way. However, I won't admit it. Zadier gritted his teeth. So, you're saying so much because you don't want to kill Chang Tian with me, right? The Saint Emperor nodded. You can ask me for help. Chang Tian can also ask Atheist for help. We still don't have much of a chance of winning in a one-on-one battle. Since that's the case, why make a wasted trip? Zadier sneered. Atheist is just a weapon spirit. If you're willing to awaken the Insect Queen, we'll have another helper. If you're not willing to awaken the Insect Queen, I can help you. Chapter 1405. When Qin Chuan returned to the capital of Starting Point, what he saw was a thriving and bustling city. The humans and demons who had left the land of exile had completely adapted to their new living environment. They got along harmoniously, worked, and cultivated. Their daily lives were no different from the other races in the universe. This made Qin Chuan feel very gratified. After Qin Chuan returned, he first looked for Long Xiao and asked her to arrange for people to return to the Center of Heirs to receive those who wanted to come out. As for the method to break the seal of the land of exile, he would naturally teach Long Xiao. After chatting with Long Xiao, Qin Chuan did not rest. Instead, he went to Long Xiao's independent cultivation room and prepared to stay in the cultivation room for a while. In the past period of time, Qin Chuan had been busy with some things. It had been a long time since he stopped to cultivate properly. In terms of diligence, Qin Chuan should be the laziest among the demigods. Qin Chuan sat cross-legged in the cultivation room, lowered his head, and pondered over some of the things that had happened during this period of time. He summed up his experience and sorted out his gains and losses. It had been nearly half a year since the disbandment of the Endless Allied Forces. The actions of the Division of Justice did not achieve the results he wanted. Instead, they suffered heavy losses because of the appearance of Zadier. The one who had gained the most should be the Little Armor Dragon. Along the way, the Little Armor Dragon had devoured a lot of good things. From the demigod power of demigods to the divine power of ultimate existences, it had all been devoured by the Little Armor Dragon at least once. Every time it devoured a stronger power, there would be some strange changes in the Little Armor Dragon's body. For example, this time, the Little Armor Dragon had gained the ability to control the divine power of the void. Although the amount of divine power that the Little Armor Dragon could control was limited and only a small part of it, it was still amazing enough. Thinking of this, Qin Chuan summoned the Little Armor Dragon. Looking at the sleepy Little Armor Dragon, Qin Chuan asked it, Can your ability to control the divine power of the void become stronger? Upon hearing Qin Chuan's question, the Little Armor Dragon pondered for a moment before replying, I need to eat more. Upon hearing Little Armor Dragon's reply, Qin Chuan understood what Little Armor Dragon meant. If Little Armor Dragon wanted to control more void divine power, it would need to devour more void divine power. However, only Zadier possessed void divine power. It would not be easy for the Little Armor Dragon to find another opportunity to devour void divine power. Other than void godly power, can you devour other godly powers? Qin Xuan asked curiously. Are you able to control whatever divine power you have devoured? The little armored dragon thought for a moment, then shook its head and said, I don't know. Little armored dragon didn't know if it could do something that hadn't been tested before. Upon hearing little armored dragon's answer, Qin Xuan smiled and said, It seems like I'm making things difficult for you. However, I believe that it won't be long before I can help you with your next experiment. After sending little armored dragon back into the brain to continue sleeping, Qin Xuan prepared to start cultivating. This time, Qin Xuan wanted to systematically cultivate the thunder-devouring technique. At this point in time, if one were to ask which law domain Qin Xuan could control the most power and had the best chance of becoming an ultimate existence, it would definitely be the thunder domain. As the strongest demigod in the thunder domain, Rengar, as fall caused most of the power of law in the thunder domain to be in an ownerless state. Anyone who had comprehended the law of thunder could attempt to control this ownerless power of law. Not long ago, Qin Xuan had once controlled a small portion of the ownerless power of law. Hence, he was promoted to a demigod in the thunder domain. Now, Qin Xuan needed to calm down and work hard to control more of the ownerless power of law in the thunder domain. If there wasn't any, then he would steal it. Since the thunder-devouring technique was called thunder-devouring, how could it grow without devouring lightning? Holy Cluster, Sage Monarch Continent, Sage Palace. In the gloomy palace, the Sage Emperor sat on a high platform. On the table in front of him was a white glove. The glove seemed to be made of some kind of special leather. It was seamless, and there were no signs of stitching. Moreover, the glove was very long, enough to cover the entire arm of an ordinary person. The Sage Emperor looked at the glove in front of him and fell into a long silence. Ever since the day he talked to Zadier, he had been in this position. It had been dozens of days since he moved. During this time, Zadier had come looking for him again. His words were very arrogant, and his attitude was very bad. I'll only give you 3 days. If you can't make a decision by then, I'll do it myself. Zadier's words still echoed in the Sage Emperor's ears. He knew that Zadier wasn't joking. He really would do it. As for stopping Zadier, it wasn't as if he could stop Zadier just because he wanted to. After all, the white glove had flown to him on its own. Similarly, the glove could also fly to Zadier on its own. The Sage Emperor knew that although the insect queen's consciousness had yet to fully awaken, it wasn't completely unaware of the outside world. Right now, the insect queen was giving him a choice. Either he awakened the insect queen's consciousness on his own accord, or he let Zadier do it for him. If Zadier did it for him, then the divine artifact would belong to Zadier. With that in mind, the Sage Emperor finally made his decision. He picked up the white glove and slowly put his right arm into it. When the glove was completely on his right arm, something strange happened. Inside the white glove, where the outside world couldn't see, countless mouth parts suddenly grew out. These mouth parts were filled with fine, sharp teeth, and they viciously bit into the Sage Emperor's arm. The sturdy carapace on the Sage Emperor's arm was torn apart by these mouth parts in less than a second. Then, these mouth parts grew long and thin, and they ruthlessly pierced into the flesh of the Sage Emperor's arm. Gulp, gulp. These mouth parts wildly devoured the essence in the Sage Emperor's flesh. Their greed was like a bottomless pit, and they were completely insatiable. The Sage Emperor's expression was extremely calm in the face of these mouth parts' frenzied devouring. Clearly, he had already expected this to happen. This was also the reason why he had been unwilling to awaken the insect queen's consciousness for so long. This white glove was a divine artifact, but it also ate people. Chapter 1406. After 5 minutes of being devoured by the white glove, the Saint King's face was extremely pale. His aura was also extremely weak. In this state, the Saint King looked like he could not even stand up to a gust of wind. It was as though a demigod could easily defeat him. After devouring a large amount of the sage emperor's flesh and blood, the white glove had become sparkling and translucent. It was round and full and looked extremely beautiful. The sage emperor looked down at the white glove and pursed his lips. "You've eaten your fill. It's time to wake up." As the saint emperor's voice fell, a small protrusion slowly appeared on the surface of the white glove. This protrusion gradually took the shape of a white larva. This larva's lower body was fused into the white glove, while its upper body was covered in rings. Above its head was an extremely malevolent and evil red eyeball. Bai Xing, an extremely pleasant and even somewhat seductive voice sounded from the white larva. However, the sage emperor, called Bai Xing, did not feel seductive at all. He only felt that it was eerie and terrifying. However, Shirahoshi did not show this emotion. On the surface, he still looked cold and calm. "You should be able to appear as a weapon spirit now. Why you have to face me like this?" Bai Xing looked at the red eyeball and sighed. In the end, he still took this step and awakened the insect queen from her slumber. "How long has it been?" "It's been more than 4,000 years. You're finally willing to wake me up?" A figure suddenly appeared behind Bai Xing. Her skin was as white as snow. Her figure was exquisite, and her appearance was even more beautiful. She placed her hands on Bai Xing's shoulders and moved her pink lips close to Bai Xing's ears as she murmured in a low voice. It didn't seem like she was complaining about Bai Xing, but more like she was whispering sweet nothings. The insect queen's actions made Bai Xing involuntarily recall some things that had happened many years ago. It was delightful and memorable. However, at this moment, Bai Xing's heart was as still as water. He was unmoved. "If I had known that turning you into a divine weapon would lead to this, I would definitely have stopped you." Hearing Bai Xing's words, the insect queen giggled and said, "If I had known you were such a heartless man, and that you wouldn't wake me up even after 4,000 years, I wouldn't have let you onto my bed, and I wouldn't have helped you become a supreme being." The insectoid queen's words were extremely bold and shocking. If this were to spread, it would shock the entire holy cluster, or even the entire universe. Bai Xing fell silent in the face of the insect queen's words. Strictly speaking, he had indeed let the insect queen down. Seeing Shirahoshi remain silent, the insect queen continued to ask, "Why aren't you saying anything? Are you feeling guilty because you feel guilty?" Bai Xing sighed and said to the insect queen, "Do you think it's a good thing that we've become like this?" As he spoke, Bai Xing raised his right arm and glanced at the white glove that was tightly wrapped around his arm. At this moment, the white glove had taken root on his arm and could no longer be removed. If he tried to forcefully remove the white glove, then one of them would definitely die, while the other would be injured. If he did not take off the white glove, as the two of them continued to fuse, their consciousness would uncontrollably fuse. By then, he would no longer be the Holy Emperor Bai Xing, and the Insect Queen would no longer be the Insect Queen. Their consciousness, including their personalities, would fuse into a new person. No one knew whether this new person would be a madman or a fool. Just thinking about it made Bai Xing shiver. Isn't it a good thing that we've become like this? This way, we can stay together every day and feel each other's existence at all times. We'll never be separated. Compared to the negative things that Shirahoshi was thinking about, the Insect Queen was more concerned about the positive things. For example, how powerful would the combination of a supreme being and a divine weapon be? Or how they could stay together every day and never be separated again. These were the things that the Insect Queen cared about. As for the other things, she could temporarily ignore them, even if Bai Xing had woken her up after she had been asleep for 4,000 years. In the face of the Insect Queen's words, Bai Xing could only sigh and say nothing. "All right, don't sigh anymore." The Insect Queen gently stroked Bai Xing's forehead and whispered into his ear, "With me here, you don't have to worry about that you who might return at any time. He's no match for us now. You've underestimated him and overestimated our combined strength." Bai Xing would never underestimate his opponents, especially you. Although you is terrifying, that's the you of ancient times. He had the runic sword and powerful allies. But what about him now? He's imprisoned in a place where there's no light at all. It's a question of when he'll be able to escape, let alone other things. The insect queen was aware of everything that had happened during this period of time. This was because her consciousness had been in a semi-conscious state for a very long time, allowing her to receive information from the outside world. However, the information had been stored at that time, and she was only able to decipher it after she had completely woken up. What if Qin Xuan dies? Bai Xing looked at the insect queen with a complicated expression. He did not wish for Qin Xuan to die, but Qin Xuan was just too much of a threat. Then don't kill Qin Xuan for now. Isn't that fine? The insect queen smiled. Now that I'm helping you, Zadier won't be able to threaten you. You don't understand. Bai Xing shook his head and said, this matter isn't as simple as you think. With Zadier's strength, he could easily kill Qin Xuan even without Bai Xing's help. The reason why Zadier sought Bai Xing's help was to deal with heaven and atheists. This had nothing to do with Qin Xuan. Once Zadier calmed down and temporarily forgot the humiliation that heaven had brought him, Qin Xuan would once again face the threat of death. All right, let's not continue thinking about these things. Now that we're finally reunited, shouldn't we think and do some happy things? As she spoke, the insect queen's body had already fallen into Bai Xing's arms. I've already taken the initiative to do so much. Are you sure you want to continue being indifferent? Bai Xing finally moved in response to the insect queen's words. He reached out and gently caressed the insect queen's smooth cheeks, then leaned over and kissed the insect queen's pink lips. Chapter 1407. Universe Calendar, Year 14. 63 million, February. This is the third month since Qin Xuan returned to the city of Starting Point. During this period, except for the reunion with everyone during the New Year, he spent the rest of his time in the cultivation room. In these 2 months, Qin Xuan worked hard to cultivate the thunder-devouring art and achieved very good results. In the field of the law of thunder, he has controlled more than 70% of the power, and this is not the end. He continues to control more power. Ding dong. The doorbell of the cultivation room suddenly rang. Hearing the sound, Qin Xuan stopped cultivating and opened his eyes to look at the monitoring system. When he saw that the person standing outside the cultivation room was Lu Zi, he controlled the access control system to open the door of the cultivation room. When the door of the cultivation room opened, Lu Zi walked in from the outside. She glanced at Qin Xuan and asked, "How's your cultivation recently?" Qin Xuan smiled and said, "It's not bad." After asking about Qin Xuan's recent cultivation progress, Lu Zi said to Qin Xuan, "I came to disturb your cultivation this time because heaven wants to see you." Hearing Lu Zi's words, Qin Xuan was a little surprised and asked, "Heaven wants to see me?" Lu Zi nodded and said, "Our city of Starting Point has an interstellar transmission array that leads directly to Stansos. You can go there at any time. Heaven will wait for you in District 1. Qin Xuan heard this and asked with some doubts, "Did heaven say why it wants to see me?" Lu Zi shook her head and said, "This matter was told to me by Sharmila. I only know that heaven wants to see you. I don't know the details." Qin Xuan nodded and said, "In that case, I'll go there." After saying that, Qin Xuan got up and walked outside with Lu Zi. On the way to activate the interstellar transmission array, Lu Zi hesitated for a moment and said to Qin Xuan, "Don't put too much pressure on yourself. It's better to let nature take its course." Hearing Lu Zi's words, Qin Xuan was stunned for a moment. Then he asked with a smile, "You were concerned about my recent cultivation progress because you were worried that I was in a hurry to succeed?" Lu Zi nodded and said, "You have done enough, whether it's for everyone or for others. You have done your best. Everyone saw how hard you worked to cultivate and increase your strength. On one hand, they were worried that you might go berserk. On the other hand, everyone felt a bit ashamed. That's why they've been cultivating so diligently. However, it was also because of this that Huang Feng almost went berserk. Fortunately, he was discovered in time, so his foundation wasn't damaged." When Qin Xuan heard this, He frowned slightly and said, "My cultivation is my own business. Why must everyone force me?" Luzi helplessly smiled and said, "I can understand you, but the others can't." Qingchuan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He asked, "Then what should I do?" Luzi had already thought of a countermeasure. She said to Qingchuan, "I suggest that you find something for everyone to do. For example, training the army. Make everyone busy. This way, everyone won't feel like they can't help you." Although they weren't able to help Qingchuan in battle, they could still help Qingchuan in other aspects. "I understand what you mean. How about this? You help me arrange something for everyone to do. Just say that it's my idea." Qingchuan helplessly smiled and said to Luzi, "That's the only thing we can do right now." Luzi nodded and said to Qingchuan, "I understand." When Qingchuan arrived at Stansos through the interstellar transmission formation and entered the first region, Thelon, who had been waiting for a long time, led Qingchuan to Heaven Emperor's residence. At this moment, Heaven Emperor was in Heaven Emperor's vegetable garden, planting vegetables with Heaven Emperor. When Qingchuan arrived, he saw Heaven Emperor and Heaven Emperor. Both of them were wearing hemp clothes and were covered in mud. They were barefooted as they planted vegetables in the garden. From the looks of it, they seemed to be enjoying themselves. They didn't find it boring at all. For us Tian people, cultivating the heart is more important than cultivation. Thelon smiled and said to Qingchuan, "I won't hide it from you. I've also opened up a small vegetable garden in my residence. I prepare and plant vegetables there. You can tell me what you like to eat. I'll plant some, and I'll invite you to eat when I harvest them." Qingchuan laughed and said, "My taste is very easy to satisfy, as long as it's vegetables." As the two of them talked, they approached the vegetable garden. Heaven Emperor and Heaven Emperor had already noticed their arrival. Heaven Emperor walked out of the vegetable garden and casually patted the mud off his hands. He then sat on the ground and said to Qingchuan, "Qingchuan, come and sit." Qingchuan walked to Heaven Emperor and sat down in front of him. He said, "I heard that Senior was looking for me. What is it?" Heaven Emperor looked at Qingchuan and asked, "How much power do you control in the Law of Thunder domain? How far are you from 90%? Hearing Heaven Emperor's words, Qingchuan asked in surprise, "Senior, how do you know that I control the Law of Thunder domain?" Heaven Emperor smiled and explained to Qingchuan, "After witnessing the battle between me and Zendir, you must be very eager to obtain divine power. Among the various powers of laws that you control, only the Law of Thunder domain has the conditions to reach the pinnacle. As for the other powers of laws, I don't have to tell you. You know that it's very difficult." After hearing Heaven's explanation, Qingchuan understood that it was because he had been cultivating in seclusion during this period of time that made Heaven realize his thoughts. Indeed, the heavens were right. Among the laws of lightning, the laws of space, and the laws of time that Qingchuan currently controlled, only in the law of lightning could he advance to the pinnacle. However, with Yu's existence in the law of space and the law of time, it was basically impossible for him to reach the pinnacle with the help of those two powers of laws. Qingchuan nodded honestly and said, "That's right. I've been controlling the Law of Thunder domain recently. I hope that I can reach the pinnacle in the Law of Thunder domain. Right now, I'm about 20% away from reaching the threshold of the pinnacle. Controlling more than 90% of the power of laws in a single Law of Thunder domain was the minimum threshold for reaching the pinnacle. Qingchuan currently controlled more than 70% of the power of laws in the Law of Thunder domain. He was very close to the threshold, but the closer he got, the more difficult it would be." Heaven Emperor smiled when he heard Qingchuan's words. He asked, "If I have a way to help you reach the pinnacle in the shortest amount of time, would you be willing?" Chapter 1408. Hearing Heaven's words, Qingchuan was a little surprised. Heaven actually had a way to help him become a supreme existence in the shortest time possible. Qingchuan thought for a moment, then frowned slightly and asked, "Senior, are you trying to use some special method to increase the unowned power in the Law of Thunder domain so that I can control it more easily? Heaven chuckled and said, "The special method you're talking about, are you referring to coercion or assassination of other cultivators who control the law of thunder?" Qin fell silent. That's right, that was what he was thinking. Because other than this method that could help him quickly control more of the law of thunder, he couldn't think of a better method. Seeing Qin fall silent, Heaven reached out and patted Qin's shoulder, leaving a black handprint. Then he said to Qin, "We Tian people have always pursued the path of nature. We won't force ourselves to do things deliberately. Don't think of us as too dark." Hearing Heaven's words, Qin let out a sigh of relief in his heart. At the same time, he revealed an extremely ashamed expression and said to Heaven, "Sorry, my thoughts were too dirty. It's human nature, I can understand." Heaven smiled and didn't take it to heart. Seeing this, Qin immediately asked, "Senior, what is the method you're talking about?" Heaven stopped smiling and said with a serious tone, "Use the power of oaths to help you become a supreme existence." Hearing Heaven's answer, Qin was a little surprised and asked, "The power of oaths?" Song Tian nodded. "You know about the power of oaths. This is the law domain I control. In the Heaven Star Cluster, there are countless people who make oaths to the Heaven Star Cluster every day, making promises or making guarantees. Some people fulfill their promises and guarantees, while others break their promises. In the end, they will not have a good ending." This time, Qin understood what the heavens meant. The heavens wanted him to make an oath and borrow the power of the oath to ascend to the pinnacle of existence. "Senior, the power of oaths should be more of a binding ability, right?" Qin was extremely curious. How exactly was this going to work? Hearing this, Chang Tian said to Qin, "It's actually very simple. You just have to swear that you must reach the pinnacle of the law of thunder within a certain period of time, and I can help you." Hearing Heaven's words, Qin was stunned. "It's that simple." Chang Tian shook his head and said, "This matter isn't as simple as it seems on the surface. Firstly, you need to swear an oath. Only then can I borrow the power of the oath to help you. Secondly, I'm not the only one helping you this time. Atheist is also helping you." Qin was surprised and asked, "The only true God, Atheist?" Heaven nodded and told Qin, "Indeed, it is Atheist. He wields the power of prayers. With his abilities and my power of oath, it is more than enough to help you ascend to the peak of existence. However, there is one more thing. You will need to pay a certain price." During the oath, Qin was a little confused and asked, "What price?" Heaven explained to Qin, "There is always a price for an oath. For example, if you don't take revenge, you are not human. This oath is the price for the oath." "So this is the price you're talking about?" Qin was enlightened and asked again, "Then what price should I pay?" Heaven took a deep look at Qin and said, "You need to think about what price you need to pay. Because this matter involves the existence of the pinnacle of existence. The greater the price you are willing to pay, the higher the success rate." Hearing Heaven's words, Qin couldn't help but fall silent. At this moment, Qin had too many things to think about. Seeing Qin fall silent, Heaven didn't disturb Qin. He just quietly looked at Qin and waited for Qin to respond. After about 5 minutes, Qin raised his head and looked at Heaven. He asked, "Senior, I have a few questions. First, why are you helping me? Why are you not helping the other Tian people?" Heaven wasn't surprised that Qin would ask this question. He explained to Qin, "Because only you have the highest chance of ascending to the pinnacle of existence in a short period of time. The others don't have this qualification. Even if we help them, they won't succeed." Qin believed Heaven's explanation. Because other than Heaven Emperor, who was a demigod, the other Tian people were all at the tribulation passing stage. They didn't have the potential to ascend to the pinnacle of existence. Heaven Emperor was the successor of Heaven. Before this generation of Heaven fell, Heaven Emperor naturally couldn't ascend to the pinnacle of existence. As for God Lord Apollo and Pope Saint Baudelaire, They were both at the tribulation passing stage and had yet to become demigods. So after thinking about it, he was the most suitable person. Heaven looked at Qin Chuan and said, "Actually, your friends Lu Zi and Zhou Lin are also very good candidates. They have both become demigods and are well-known figures in their respective law domains. If you help them, they will have a high chance of ascending to the pinnacle of existence. But the problem is that you are the most suitable and the most powerful among all of them. Only helping you is worth it." Qin Chuan looked deeply at Heaven and said, "One last question. Can I completely trust you?" Hearing Qin Chuan's question, Heaven Emperor and Thelon's expressions changed slightly. Long before Heaven had the intention to help Qin Chuan, they had already expected that Qin Chuan would ask such a sharp question. If they raised it, it would inevitably hurt the relationship between the two sides. But if they didn't raise it, Qin Chuan would definitely feel uneasy. Perhaps it would cause his ascension to fail because of this. At that time, when faced with this question, Heaven said something very interesting. Heaven said that if Qin Chuan didn't raise this question, then Qin Chuan wouldn't have been able to reach his current height, let alone ascend to the pinnacle of existence. Even if Qin Chuan was lucky enough to ascend to the pinnacle of existence, he wouldn't be able to become stronger. This was because a person who had absolute trust in other people without any doubts would never become a powerhouse. Powerhouses needed true friends. But at the same time, powerhouses were lonely and couldn't completely trust others. Since ancient times, those who trusted others unconditionally wouldn't have a good ending. This was because people like that weren't very smart. Even Lu Zi, who had always trusted Qin Chuan, would sometimes raise her doubts. It was very difficult for Qin Chuan to completely trust Heaven. Heaven smiled. "Hee, you could trust us. I can swear to myself." Chapter 1409. In the face of Heaven's joking guarantee, Qin Chuan decided to believe in Heaven after careful consideration. He could not think of any reason why Heaven would frame him. "Senior, please help me." Qin Chuan stood up and bowed deeply to Heaven. His attitude was very sincere. Heaven stood up and said to Qin Chuan, "Then you can make the oath now. But remember, it cannot be too short or too long. Around 3 months is more suitable." Qin Chuan nodded, then raised his right hand and swore, "I, Qin Chuan, hereby swear that I will definitely become an ultimate existence in the next 3 months. If I can't do it, then I will never become an ultimate existence in this lifetime." Heaven was silent for a moment when he heard Qin Chuan's words. Then he asked Qin Chuan, "Your oath is now effective. I'll ask you one last time. Are you sure?" Qin Chuan nodded and said, "I'm sure." After Heaven received Qin Chuan's confirmation, he said to Qin Chuan, "The oath has been established. Now, it's time to move on to the second step of the plan." The second step of the plan was actually very simple. It was to let Qin Chuan start cultivating. To be more specific, it was to let Qin Chuan snatch more of the power of law in the domain of the law of thunder. When Qin Chuan sat down on the grassland and began cultivating the thunder-devouring art, he was very surprised to find that when he controlled the power of law, his speed was actually much faster than before. Just as Qin Chuan was feeling surprised, Heaven's voice suddenly rang in his ears. If you find that your speed of controlling the power of law has increased when you cultivate, don't be surprised. That's the effect of the oath and wish power. Hearing Tsang Tian's words, Qin Chuan could not help but reveal a look of realization on his face. So this was what Tsang Tian meant by helping him. Increasing the speed of one's control over the power of laws was indeed a very simple and crude method of assistance. Qin Chuan speculated that if he continued to cultivate at his current speed, it would take him about 4 to 5 months to master the law of thunder, which was still a little slower than the time he had promised when he made the oath. Thinking of this, Qin Chuan couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. However, after thinking about it, he still decided to cultivate first. It wouldn't be too late to think about other things after the 3-month deadline. The land of the silver hoop. Lei Gu was one of the geniuses of the younger generation of the Lei family. He had reached the peak of the Dongshu realm when he was only 100 years old. As long as he could cross the threshold between the peak of the Dongshu realm and the peak of the Dongshu realm, he was confident that he could reach the form synthesis stage within 3 years and become the new overlord of the Lei family. It was also because of this that Lei Gu had always been extremely domineering in the Lei family. No matter what benefits there were, he would use his fists to seize them. Even if others had their benefits stolen by Lei Gu, they would only be angry but not dare to say anything. Today, it was time for the Lei family's logistics union to distribute cultivation resources. It was said that the logistics union would distribute a 4,000-year-old thunder herb today. It could greatly increase the speed of a cultivator's comprehension of the law of thunder. It could be said that it was a treasure that could only be found by chance. Lei Gu was determined to obtain this thunder herb. When Lei Gu arrived at the logistics union, there was already a long queue at the window where the cultivation resources were distributed. Lei Gu did not follow the rules like the others to the back of the queue. Instead, he walked straight to the front of the queue. Although the people in the queue were very angry when they saw this scene, they did not dare to say anything. "Manager, where is the thunder herb?" Lei Gu walked to the window and directly asked the manager who was distributing the cultivation resources about the thunder herb with a cold expression. Hearing Lei Gu's words, the manager smiled and said, "So, with young Master Lei Gu, are you also here for the thunder herb?" Lei Gu frowned slightly and asked, "Is there someone else who is interested in the thunder herb?" The manager nodded and said helplessly, "You're right. 2 minutes before you came, young Master Leia took the thunder herb." Leia. When he heard this name, Lei Gu's expression suddenly became gloomy. If there was anyone in the Lei family who could be compared to him in terms of talent, it would be Leia. In the past, Leia had always been Lei Gu's competitor. No matter what, they would compete to see who was better. Now that both of them were at the peak of the Dongshu realm, their battle strength and comprehension of the law of thunder were about the same. If one of them could obtain the thunder herb and use its ability to speed up their comprehension of the law of thunder, they might be able to seize the opportunity to break through to the peak of the Dongshu realm and then advance to the form synthesis stage. Therefore, no matter what, he could not let Leia obtain the thunder herb. Thinking of this, Lei Gu turned around and flew towards Leia's residence. When the crowd saw the direction Lei Gu flew in, they all became excited. At this moment, anyone could see that Lei Gu was going to find Leia to snatch the thunder herb. Go, go, go. Let's go watch the show and come back later to queue up. Let's go, let's go. The battle between Leia and Lei Gu is going to be the most exciting. I bet 10 third-grade star stones that Lei Gu will definitely win. The crowd followed Lei Gu's departing figure and quickly chased after him. In front of them, Lei Gu had already blocked Leia, who was leisurely returning to his residence. Leia looked at the menacing Lei Gu. He didn't need to guess to know that Lei Gu was here for the thunder herb. He chuckled and said to Lei Gu, you don't need to say anything. I know that you're here for the thunder herb. Unfortunately, I've already beat you to it. I can't let you have it." Lei Gu was furious when he heard Leia's words. He said in a deep voice, "Cut the crap. Same old rules, a fair duel. The thunder herb will belong to whoever wins." Leia laughed and said to Lei Gu, in the past, when we had a fair duel, we were fighting for the treasures that had yet to be distributed. This time, the thunder herb is already in my hands. It already belongs to me. Why should I have a fair duel with you?" Leia walked in front of Lei Gu as he spoke. He reached out his hand and patted Lei Gu's shoulder lightly. He sneered and said, "I can't wait to see you grovel in front of me and call me Senior Leia. I'm really looking forward to it." Lei Gu's face turned red when he heard Leia's words. He would rather die than let that happen. Leia was very satisfied when he saw the change in Lei Gu's expression. He walked around Lei Gu and continued forward. At this moment, Lei Gu suddenly roared and launched a sneak attack on Leia. Die! Chapter 14:10. A month passed by in a flash. Qin had made great progress in the Thunder Law domain while cultivating the thunder-devouring art in seclusion this time. The power he controlled had already reached 80%, and he only needed 10% more to reach the threshold of becoming a perfected existence. However, the progress would become slower and slower. Now, Qin progress had slowed down. While Qin was cultivating, Heaven had been paying attention to some of the things that happened in the universe. Although the universe was huge and there were all kinds of things happening all the time, Heaven could clearly feel that there were more things related to the Thunder Law domain happening in the universe recently. For example, two geniuses of a certain family fought, and one died, while the other was injured. Another example was that a certain overlord of the Thunder Law domain accidentally died while exploring a ruin. Another example was that a certain overlord of the Thunder Law domain became a cripple because of cultivating in seclusion. There were too many things like this that had happened. Some things attracted the attention of more people, while some things were not known by many people. However, these things were no secret to Heaven because they were inseparable from him. The Sky Emperor sat beside Heaven and looked at him with a complicated gaze. He sighed and said, "Heaven, we once promised Qin that we would not harm others to help him become a perfected existence." Heaven looked at the Sky Emperor calmly and said, "I have never harmed anyone. This is the effect of the power of oaths and wishes. It has nothing to do with us." The Sky Emperor smiled bitterly when he heard Heaven's response. If Qin knew about this, what would he think? Heaven looked at the Sky Emperor's bitter smile and asked, "Do you think that if Qin did not make an oath, these things would have happened?" Hearing Heaven's question, Heaven Emperor didn't know how to answer it. If these things were affected by the power of oaths and wishes, then they were definitely there. However, no one knew how big the influence was, or if they didn't have this influence, then these things wouldn't have happened. Seeing the Sky Emperor's silence, Heaven asked again, "Let me ask you again. If we did not participate, do you think Qin could have become a perfected existence?" This time, the Sky Emperor did not remain silent. He replied, "With Qin's talent and heaven-defying performance, he has a great chance of becoming a perfected existence." Speaking of this, the Sky Emperor sighed and said, "When Qin first came to Stansos, he was just an unknown early-stage Dongshu cultivator. I didn't expect that in such a short time, he would have grown to such an astonishing level." Heaven nodded. "You see, even without our help, Qin could have become a perfected existence. All we did was make Qin's progress a bit faster." In other words, even without our influence, the people who got into trouble would still have gotten into trouble. Perhaps they would have used a different method, or perhaps they would have delayed a bit. But what is meant to happen will happen. The Sky Emperor did not know how to refute Heaven's explanation. It sounded like sophistry. Heaven understood the Sky Emperor and could easily see through the Sky Emperor's thoughts. However, he did not explain further. There was no need to. Things had already come to this point, and there was no point in saying anything. Wait until Qin comes out of seclusion. You can tell him about these things. After Tsang Tian said this to Sky Emperor, he got up and left. Sage Monarch Continent, Sage Palace. Zindir had once again come to the Sage Palace, but this time he had lost all patience. "Sage Emperor, are you going to help me or not?" Zindir looked at the white glove on the Sage Emperor's arm, and a hint of fear flashed in his eyes. He might not have been afraid of the Sage Emperor in the past, but with the help of the Insect Queen, he was no match for the Sage Emperor. Therefore, even if he had lost all patience, the only thing he could do now was to interrogate Zindir. The Sage Emperor sat on the high platform and looked calmly at Zindir. He replied, "This is your own matter. Forgive me for not being able to help you." Hearing the Sage Emperor's answer, a cold smile appeared on Zindir's face. He said, "It seems that with the Insect Queen's help, you're really confident." As soon as Zindir finished speaking, the Insect Queen's figure slowly appeared in the Sage Emperor's arms. She leaned against the Sage Emperor's chest and looked askance at Zindir. She asked, "What? Do you have a problem with that?" In the face of the insect queen's undisguised killing intent, Zindir's face could not help but turn ashen. He said in a deep voice, "Very well. Since you're not willing to help me, I'll go myself." With that, Zindir turned around and prepared to leave. "Wait a minute. Who said that we're not willing to help you?" At this moment, the insect queen suddenly spoke again, causing Zindir to stop in his tracks. Zindir turned around and looked at the insect queen suspiciously. He then looked at the sage emperor and asked, "You're willing to help me? Then why did you reject me just now?" Zindir was not the only one who was puzzled. The sage emperor was equally puzzled. He lowered his head and looked at the insect queen, wanting to know what she was thinking. The insect queen smiled and said to Zindir, "The sage emperor and I combined our combat power could be said to be the #1 in the world. You want us to help you? Is that why you were so aggressive earlier?" Hearing the insect queen's words, Zindir suppressed the anger in his heart and forced a smile on his face. He said, "I was wrong just now. I'm really sorry. I apologize to you, brother sage emperor." Seeing that the situation had taken a turn for the better, Zindir immediately became a different person. He apologized to the sage emperor with a smile and even called him brother intimately. It was clear that Zindir was really a temperamental madman. No matter what he did, it would not be too surprising. The insect queen chuckled and turned to look at the sage emperor. She asked, "Sage emperor, have you forgiven his rude behavior now?" Hearing the insect queen's words, the sage emperor remained silent and did not answer. Seeing this, the insect queen did not mind. She turned to Zindir again and said, "We can help you, but we have a condition. Once we kill Chong Tian and Atheus, our sacred tribe will annex the celestial cluster. As for the Deus cluster, we can leave it to your void empire." Hearing the insect queen's condition, Zindir laughed and said straightforwardly, "I was wondering what kind of condition it was. As long as you're willing to help, once the matter is done, the celestial cluster will belong to you. P.S. Previously, a book friend raised a problem. The calculation of time in the universal calendar year 146X is wrong. This is a mistake I made when writing the book. I apologize to everyone here. The text will be changed to universal calendar year 146X. There is no 10,000. I apologize again." You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.